child, asleep in a motel bed, awakens to fire, flames set not by fate, but by his own father's hand. What should have ended in ash became instead a story of scars, survival, and a fight for life the world would never forget. It began like any ordinary winter day in Brooklyn, the kind of day that passed unnoticed by the thousands of commuters shuffling underground to catch the morning train. But in the final week of February 1983, the ordinary was quietly unraveling into something unspeakable, something that no one could have imagined. For a 6-year-old boy named David Rothenberg, what should have been a simple school week would become the beginning of a nightmare that shocked the world. David was a bright, playful child, full of the restless energy of boyhood. He loved video games, trips to the park, and the simple joys of life that any first grader might cling to. His home was Carroll Gardens, a close-knit neighborhood in Brooklyn, where row houses lined the streets and children played under the watchful eyes of parents and grandparents. His mother, Marie, worked hard to give him stability. His father, Charles, lived nearby after the divorce, still very much present in David's life, perhaps too present, and in ways that would come to haunt them all. On the surface, Charles Rothenberg could be charming, even magnetic. He had the kind of personality that drew people in, confident, smiling, full of bravado. But underneath that facade ran darker currents. Volatility, obsession, and a long history of brushes with the law. To David, though, Charles was daddy, a larger-than-life figure who indulged his every whim. From the moment David was born, Charles had showered him with gifts, toys, and attention, as if trying to mold the perfect father-son bond through sheer force of material devotion. That devotion, however, had an edge. Charles's love wasn't steady or nurturing. It was consuming, possessive, and fragile. If David cried, Charles saw it as an offense. If Marie tried to discipline him, Charles would lash out. The marriage couldn't survive such volatility, and by the late 1970s, Marie and Charles divorced. Marie, bruised by both emotional and physical abuse, carried on with determination, raising David as best she could. She believed, as did nearly everyone around her, that despite his flaws, Charles would never hurt his son. That belief would be shattered forever. In late February 1983, Charles asked to take David for a visit. He claimed he had a few days off before starting a new job and wanted to spend them with his son. To Marie, there was nothing unusual in that request. Visitation was routine, and Charles lived only a few blocks away. David adored his time with his father, the outings, the gifts, the games. When Charles showed up with a brand new suitcase, brimming with excitement about a special trip, David's eyes lit up. It seemed innocent enough, a father wanting to make memories with his boy. But Marie couldn't shake a faint unease. Something about Charles's demeanor, the way he dismissed David's beloved Atari games, the casual lie about a trip to the Catskills in the middle of winter, it didn't add up. Still, what harm could come? Charles had never so much as raised a hand to David before. And so, with a hug and a mother's lingering worry, she let her son walk out the door with his father. It would be the last time she saw David whole and unscarred. In the days that followed, Marie's unease deepened into dread. Phone calls went unanswered. Promises didn't match reality. A neighbor's child mentioned that David hadn't been at school. When Marie pressed Charles on the phone, his answers were evasive. He mumbled about time differences, about being on a farm, about things that didn't make sense. And then came the moment of revelation. A telegram, chilling in its simplicity. Charles claimed he was ending his life, and that David had been in an accident. The words hit like a thunderclap. An accident. A hospital in California. A burn unit. It made no sense, and yet it was all too real. What unfolded that week was a father's descent into something unimaginable. For reasons that would never be fully explained. Rage, desperation, control. Charles Rothenberg carried his son across the country under the promise of Disneyland. Instead, in a budget motel room near the theme park, he poured kerosene across the floor, set it alight, and walked away as flames consumed the room where David slept. What followed was chaos. explosions of glass as the fire raged, the screams of a child, strangers rushing into an inferno to pull a broken body to safety. And then the miracle that the boy lived at all. David Rothenberg would survive burns over 90% of his body. Doctors gave him less than a 5% chance, but he defied every odd. His fight for life would become a story of resilience, of community, of strangers and celebrities alike who rallied behind him. But in that first week of March 1983, all anyone could see was tragedy. As news broke, the world recoiled in horror. How could a father commit such an act against his own child? What darkness could drive a man to turn love into fire? These were the questions that haunted headlines, talk shows, and whispered conversations across the country. For Marie, there was no time for questions. Only the desperate need to reach her son in California, to walk into a burn ward and face a sight no parent should ever endure, to hold her child's hand and promise him he would not face the nightmare alone. And for David, though only 6 years old, the journey of survival had already begun. The morning after Charles took David, Brooklyn felt strangely quiet to Marie. A mother's instincts are rarely wrong, and hers were screaming. She tried to silence the unease with rational thoughts. Charles had always been devoted to David, obsessively so. He wouldn't harm him, but the silence was unnerving. Calls to Charles's apartment rang without answer. By Friday, she was frantic enough to phone David's school, only to learn he hadn't shown up for days. That was when panic seized her. Whatever Charles was planning, it wasn't just a father-son outing. He was gone, and he had taken their boy. Marie had lived long enough with Charles to understand his contradictions. To strangers, he was magnetic, the sort of man who could talk his way into jobs, convince people to trust him, and then squander every chance with theft, lies, or rage. His life had been littered with scams, failed ventures, and sudden bursts of violence. But he had also been the doting father, the man who bought toys in bulk and carried David proudly through the neighborhood. For years, Marie clung to the belief that however dangerous Charles could be to her, he would never be dangerous to David. She would soon be proven tragically wrong. By the end of February 1983, Charles was cornered. He had been fired from his restaurant job after vandalizing the computer room in retaliation. He was facing legal trouble once again. His life was unraveling, and he knew it. With nowhere left to run, Charles's obsession with David became fused with desperation. If he couldn't control his life, he could at least control the boy who loved him. And so he hatched his twisted plan. On the morning of February 26th, Charles and David boarded a plane bound for California. To David, it was an adventure. A surprise trip with his dad, the promise of Disneyland, the dream of every child from Brooklyn who had grown up on stories of castles, rides, and Mickey Mouse. To Charles, it was escape. He checked them into a holiday in near Disneyland, renting a car, trying to pass the days while he figured out his next move. But California betrayed him. Rain poured for 5 straight days, shutting down the parks, closing the beaches, trapping father and son in a motel room. For David, it was a disappointment. For Charles, it was humiliation. He had promised the world, and he could not deliver. Each day his son grew restless. Each day Charles's grip on reality loosened further. He had always defined himself by David's adoration, and now, in that stale motel room, he felt it slipping away. On March 2nd, Charles purchased a plastic container of kerosene from a local hardware store. Later that night, he moved them into a Travelodge motel, room 139. He gave David a pill, later believed to be a sleeping aid, and tucked him into bed wearing blue pajamas. Then, while his son slept, Charles doused the room with kerosene. He carried the empty container outside, placed it in a trash bin, closed the door, and walked away. At approximately midnight, the room exploded into flames. Windows shattered, curtains ignited, the carpet fused under the heat. Inside, David awoke in terror, engulfed by fire. His screams pierced the night. Guests rushed from their rooms, some grabbing fire extinguishers, others kicking at the door. 2 men tried desperately to reach him, beaten back again and again by waves of fire. And then, Crawling on hands and knees through the smoke, a businessman named Jeffrey Michelin pulled David's small body to safety. What emerged from that room was almost beyond comprehension. The boy's pajamas were gone, burned away, leaving only the neckband. 90% of his body was charred black. His skin had melted, fusing him to the carpet. His tiny body was swollen, unrecognizable, his eyes wide open but rimmed with horror. Yet he was alive. He was conscious. He fought for every breath. Paramedics rushed him to the University of California, Irvine Medical Center. Doctors there would later admit they had never seen such extensive burns on a child who was still alive. They gave him less than a 5% chance of survival. His lungs were scorched from inhaling flames. His skin was gone, leaving only raw muscle, veins, and tissue exposed. Infection loomed. Organ failure was inevitable. And yet, lying in that sterile room, David nodded when nurses asked if he could hear them. He tried to move when doctors begged him to. Even in unimaginable pain, he was fighting. Back in New York, Marie received the telegram. Its wording was as cold as it was surreal. Charles claimed he had ended his own life, and that David had been in an accident. She called the number listed, her hands trembling, only to be connected to a detective in California. Yes, a boy had been brought in. Yes, he was badly burned. Yes, he might be her son. She boarded the next flight to Los Angeles, her fiancé John by her side, bracing for a reality no parent should face. When she arrived at the burn ward, Marie didn't recognize the child before her. The swelling had distorted him. His skin was gone. He looked more like a figure made of wax and bandages than her little boy. But then, she whispered his name, and he nodded. It was David. He was alive, and he was holding on. In that moment, Marie made a promise to her son. He would not face this alone. She would sit by his bed, endure the endless surgeries, fight the infections, watch the grafts and the painful therapy. And David, in turn, made his own promise without words, that he would not give up, that no matter what his father had done, no matter how much it hurt, he would survive. The crime stunned the nation. Newspapers splashed headlines of horror. A father setting his own child ablaze. Talk shows debated what could drive a man to such a monstrous act. Communities rallied in outrage and in sympathy. And slowly, as David's survival became more than just a medical miracle, but a testament to his unbreakable spirit, he became a symbol of resilience. But in those first days of March 1983, the future was uncertain. Doctors whispered about the odds. Nurses wondered if his small body could endure even another night. And Marie prayed in the quiet of the hospital, torn between begging God to let him live and pleading to let him go peacefully if life meant only suffering. This was the beginning of David's story, a story not of fire, but of survival. A story that would stretch across decades, reshaping his life, his identity, and the way the world saw the face of resilience. And it all began in that motel room near Disneyland, where a father walked away and a child refused to die. In the sterile, humming corridors of the University of California Irvine Medical Center, the fight for David's life began the moment paramedics wheeled him through the emergency doors. He was 6 years old, yet his body bore the devastation of an inferno. Burn surgeons, nurses, and technicians flooded into the room, each trained to act quickly in the chaos of fire injuries. But nothing in their careers had prepared them for the sight before them. The boy had third-degree burns covering 90% of his body. The flames had stolen his skin, his body's natural armor against infection and dehydration. His airway was scorched, his lungs raw from inhaling fire. His head was grotesquely swollen, his eyelids turned inside out, his fingers and toes blackened at the tips. By all logic, this child should not have been alive. Yet he was conscious and he responded when spoken to. The doctors worked feverishly. They inserted catheters into his veins and arteries, pumping fluids into him before shock could take hold. They forced a breathing tube down his throat and connected him to a ventilator to keep oxygen flowing. They shaved away remnants of dead skin, applied cooling ointments, and wrapped him in gauze until he looked more specter than boy. He was fragile beyond comprehension, Yet in the quiet of that burn ward, David fought with the determination of someone who refused to surrender. When Marie arrived at the hospital, exhausted and terrified, she barely recognized the child lying on the bed. His face was swollen to 3 times its normal size. His skin, once smooth and unmarked, was now gone, replaced by oozing wounds. But then, as she whispered his name, the boy moved his head. Slowly, painfully, he nodded. It was all she needed. This was her son. He was still there, still alive, still fighting. From that moment forward, Marie planted herself by his side. She became not only a mother, but a nurse, an advocate, and a witness to every struggle. She prayed in the dark hours of the night, begging for strength she didn't know she had. She was terrified of what David's future might hold, but she clung to the simple fact that he was alive. Meanwhile, outside the hospital walls, the story broke. News anchors delivered the shocking details. A father had set fire to his 6-year-old son in a California motel. Headlines screamed of betrayal, madness, and cruelty. People across America were horrified and then captivated. Donations poured in. Strangers sent cards, letters, and prayers. Celebrities pledged support. Suddenly, David Rothenberg, the burned boy from Brooklyn, was no longer just a victim. He was becoming a symbol of courage in the face of unthinkable violence. But as the nation rallied, another battle was unfolding. The hunt for Charles Rothenberg. Police pieced together his movements with the precision of a puzzle. Witnesses recalled seeing him carry the jug of kerosene. Airline employees remembered him purchasing a ticket to San Francisco under a false name, David Love. Detectives followed the trail north, determined to capture the man who had abandoned his son to die in flames. Charles didn't vanish easily. He had always been slippery, adept at disguises, evasions, and lies. For days, he moved through California trying to stay ahead of the law. But the manhunt intensified. His photograph was everywhere, his name synonymous with monstrous betrayal. It was only a matter of time before the net closed in. Inside the hospital, none of this mattered to David. His world had shrunk to the size of a hospital bed. The steady beep of monitors, the masked faces of nurses who hovered like angels over him. The pain was constant. His body swelled grotesquely from the fluids needed to keep him alive. His skin had been so deeply destroyed that surgeons had to slice open burned tissue just to release the pressure. Every moment was agony, and yet, when asked to move, he tried. When urged to stay awake, he fought. David was determined to survive. For the doctors, he was a miracle in motion. For Marie, he was proof that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the will of a child could defy death itself. As the first hours turned into days, David's fragile body became a battlefield. Infection hovered like a predator. Even the smallest germ could end his life. Nurses sterilized every surface, every instrument, every hand that touched him. They dressed in gowns and masks, guarding him as if he were made of glass. Every dressing change was a ritual of precision, peeling away dead tissue, applying silver ointments, layering gauze, each touch bringing fresh waves of pain. And yet, David endured. Doctors warned Marie not to expect much. They explained, in gentle but honest tones, that 90% burns were unsurvivable. Children with far less damage had succumbed. But Marie refused to let go. She sat at David's bedside and whispered promises. That he was not alone, that she would not leave, that there was a life waiting for him beyond this sterile room. Whether he could truly hear or understand didn't matter. What mattered was that he felt her presence, a tether to the world outside. Word of David's struggle spread far beyond California. The story leapt from local headlines to national broadcasts, capturing hearts across America. Newspapers carried photos of a smiling boy from Brooklyn, contrasting sharply with the horrific details of what had been done to him. Talk shows debated what could drive a father to such a monstrous act. Churches held prayer vigils. School children wrote letters, some scrawled in crayon, promising that David was loved. Celebrities joined in too. Frank Sinatra sent words of encouragement. Elizabeth Taylor donated funds. Michael Jackson, deeply moved by the boy's resilience, would later befriend him, offering not just financial support, but genuine companionship. Suddenly, David was no longer just a patient. He was a symbol of hope, his survival watched by millions who longed for a miracle. Meanwhile, law enforcement's pursuit of Charles intensified. He had slipped away from the burning motel with a head start, boarding a flight to San Francisco under an alias. But he was already a marked man. Detectives scoured his known haunts, tracing credit card trails, interviewing old acquaintances. The public outcry was deafening. To the nation, Charles was no longer just a fugitive. He was the embodiment of parental betrayal. It didn't take long. Within days, police closed in on him in Northern California. His capture brought a mixture of relief and rage. In court appearances that followed, Charles spun excuses, that he had been suicidal, that he never meant to hurt his son, that it was all a desperate act gone wrong. Few believed him. The evidence was undeniable. The kerosene jug, the eyewitnesses, the explosion that tore through the motel room. This was no accident. It was intent. Back at the hospital, David clung to life one surgery at a time. Surgeons worked in marathon shifts, performing grafts, attempting to rebuild skin where none remained. His small body became a patchwork of borrowed tissue. Every operation carried risks, every procedure a chance of failure. But with each day he survived, the odds inched upward. For Marie, the hospital became her universe. She learned to sleep in waiting rooms, to measure time not in hours but in David's vital signs. She watched him endure debridements, brutal procedures where dead flesh was scraped away, and held back her own tears so he would see only strength in her eyes. She became a soldier in the war for his survival, standing guard when exhaustion threatened to consume her. Slowly, against every prediction, David stabilized. His organs rallied. His body, though ravaged, began to adapt. The boy who should not have lived was living still. Nurses began to call him the fighter. Doctors, cautious but amazed, started to whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, he could make it. The public followed every update with breathless anticipation. Television anchors reported his progress. Newspapers tracked his surgeries. Communities held fundraisers to help cover the astronomical costs of burn care. Strangers sent teddy bears, handmade blankets, prayers tucked into envelopes. David, though confined to a hospital bed, was no longer alone. He was carried on the shoulders of an entire nation. And yet, beneath the hope, the horror lingered. A child had been betrayed by the one person meant to protect him most. The questions gnawed at everyone. What darkness drove a father to ignite his own son? What wound so deep, what obsession so consuming, could justify such cruelty? The answers never came. But David's survival gave the story a new center of gravity. It was no longer solely about betrayal. It was about resilience, about the strength of a small boy who, against every odd, refused to die. By the time Charles Rothenberg sat in a courtroom to face justice, David was beginning to emerge from the shadow of death. His face was unrecognizable, his body wrapped in bandages, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. He could not yet speak, but he communicated with nods, with the squeeze of a hand, with the sheer will in his eyes. The world had witnessed horror. Now it was witnessing something greater, the birth of a survivor. In the burn unit, time lost its ordinary rhythm. Days and nights blended into one endless cycle of pain management, surgeries, and whispered prayers. For David Rothenberg, the hospital was no longer just a place of healing. It was his entire world, a battlefield where every breath was a victory and every hour survived was a small miracle. The doctors had warned Marie that her son's chances were slim. 90% of his body had been destroyed by fire. Even if his organs managed to endure, infection could end him in a matter of hours. But as the days stretched into weeks, David's resilience became undeniable. He was not only surviving, he was fighting with a willpower that astonished even the most hardened trauma surgeons. Every morning began the same way. Nurses in gowns and gloves entered his sterile room, their voices calm but firm as they prepared him for another dressing change. The process was brutal. Dead skin and tissue had to be removed to prevent infection, a procedure known as debridement. For David, it meant his body being scraped raw layer by layer while he writhed in pain. Morphine dulled the edges, but there was no escaping the agony. And yet, through tears and muffled cries, he endured it. 6 years old, and already carrying more pain than most people would face in a lifetime. Surgeries came in waves. Skin grafts were attempted again and again. When a body loses that much skin, doctors must harvest what little remains from less damaged areas. The scalp, the thighs, the rare patches spared by fire, and stretch it to cover larger wounds. Donor grafts from cadavers and temporary synthetic coverings were also used, each one a fragile shield against infection. More often than not, the grafts failed. His body rejected them or infection set in, undoing hours of painstaking surgery. But the doctors tried again and again and again. Through it all, Marie was a constant presence. She learned the medical language, the risks of septic shock, the meaning of every beep and monitor reading. She held David's hand during procedures when nurses allowed it, whispering encouragements even when her heart was breaking. She cried in silence so that he wouldn't see her despair. She became both mother and guardian, her life now measured entirely by David's survival. Outside the hospital, the world remained transfixed. Newspapers carried daily updates. Television crews camped near the medical center. America was following every twist in the story. The boy fighting for life, the mother standing vigil, the father facing justice. Letters and gifts poured in from every corner of the country. Some sent teddy bears, others handmade quilts. Many sent prayers scrawled in children's handwriting. Messages of love from strangers who wanted David to know he wasn't alone. The pressure on the medical team was immense. They were not only treating a patient, but caring for a child who had become a symbol. Each decision carried weight beyond the hospital walls. Every success was celebrated. Every setback made headlines. And yet, within the unit, the team kept their focus. David wasn't a headline to them. He was a little boy with wide brown eyes who nodded when spoken to, who clung to life with a fierceness that humbled them all. As March gave way to April, small signs of progress began to emerge. His swelling slowly decreased. His lungs, though scarred, began to stabilize under the ventilator's rhythm. Nurses began to experiment with reducing sedation, testing how long he could remain awake, how responsive he could be. His voice, silenced by tubes and trauma, was still absent, but his eyes spoke volumes. They darted to familiar faces, blinked in recognition, widened in fear during painful procedures. Slowly, the staff began to communicate with him in nods and gestures. For Marie, each flicker of recognition was priceless. When David squeezed her hand for the first time, she felt hope surge through her like electricity. When he managed to nod in rhythm to her questions, she knew her boy was still inside, still present despite the fire that had tried to erase him. But hope was fragile. Every day carried the risk of setback. A fever meant possible infection. A drop in blood pressure could signal organ failure. Any misstep could undo weeks of progress. Living on the edge of catastrophe became the new normal. And still, David fought on. Weeks passed, and what had once seemed impossible slowly began to take shape. David was not only surviving, he was beginning to rejoin the world around him. The breakthrough came quietly. One afternoon, as Marie sat by his bed humming a lullaby she used to sing when he was small, David shifted his hand. First, she thought it was a spasm, but then she felt it again, a faint squeeze around her fingers. It was deliberate. Tears flooded her eyes. For the first time since the fire, her son was reaching back. That single gesture carried the weight of 1,000 words. It was proof that behind the bandages, beneath the trauma, David's spirit remained unbroken. From then on, communication became their lifeline. Nods for yes, shakes for no. A blink to say, I understand. It was primitive, but it was enough. For a mother who had feared she'd lost her child forever, it was a miracle. Doctors noted the progress with cautious optimism. His vital signs were stabilizing. His organs were holding steady. The grafts, though fragile, were beginning to take in some areas. Each surgery brought him a little further from the brink. The risk of death was still ever present, but David had moved from hopeless to hopeful. The medical staff grew deeply attached to him. Burn nurses often carry scars of their own. The work exposes them daily to suffering most people cannot imagine. Yet even among hardened professionals, David inspired something different. They spoke of his courage, of the way he tried to cooperate even in pain. They called him our little warrior. His presence transformed the ward. Other patients, hearing of his fight, drew strength from his example. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, David's story had become a phenomenon. Reporters delivered breathless updates. News anchors spoke of the boy who refused to die. Children across the country sent drawings of castles, rainbows, and superheroes, often depicting David himself as the hero. Donations swelled into the millions, ensuring his care would never be cut short. The nation had adopted him, carrying him in their collective heart. Marie, though grateful, often felt overwhelmed by the attention. She wasn't a public figure. She was simply a mother clinging to her son. But the cameras followed her. Reporters pressed for interviews. Strangers recognized her face. She learned to balance public gratitude with private exhaustion, knowing that every dollar donated, every prayer offered, might mean another tool in the arsenal keeping David alive. Not all the attention was welcome. There were whispers in the darker corners of the media, questions about how a mother could have let her son go with a man so troubled, criticism of her past choices. Marie bore it quietly, refusing to let the noise distract her from the only thing that mattered, being at David's side. She knew the truth. No one could have predicted such an atrocity, and no one could question her devotion now. In the quiet hours of the night, when the hospital settled into its eerie silence, Marie often found herself staring at David's bandaged form, torn between awe and grief. The boy she had once known, the laughing child who ran through Carroll Park, who clutched his Atari tapes, who begged for pizza at the corner restaurant, was gone. In his place was a child remade by fire, scarred and forever changed. But he was alive, and in that truth she found the strength to go on. One evening, as nurses prepared him for yet another procedure, David did something remarkable. With his tiny, bandaged hand, he pointed weakly toward a toy that someone had left in his room, a stuffed bear sent by a stranger. His eyes locked on it, and then, painfully slowly, his lips curved into what could only be described as the faintest smile. It was the first flicker of joy since the fire. The room fell silent. Nurses exchanged glances, holding back tears. Marie bent down and kissed his swollen forehead, whispering, "That's my boy." In that moment, hope became real. David Rothenberg was not just surviving. He was beginning to live again. And outside, in courtrooms and headlines, his father faced judgment. Charles Rothenberg, once the man who called David his beautiful son, was now a symbol of cruelty. His trial loomed, his excuses already falling apart. But for David, justice was no longer about the man who tried to end his life. Justice was in the nod of his head, the squeeze of his hand, the faint smile that proved he was still here. By late spring of 1983, the battle for David's life had shifted. The immediate danger of death had passed, though not entirely, and now came the grueling, grinding war of recovery. Every day in the burn ward was a test of endurance, not only for David but for everyone who loved him. The flames that had nearly taken his life were gone, but their aftermath lingered in every scar, every surgery, every tear that fell quietly in the hospital corridors. The doctors at the University of California, Irvine, had stabilized him beyond what anyone thought possible. But his journey was far from over. For the kind of injuries he had, the most advanced and specialized care was required. And so, the decision was made. David would be transferred to the Shriners Burns Institute in Boston, one of the world's leading centers for pediatric burn treatment. The trip itself was precarious. Even with his vitals steady, moving a child with such catastrophic injuries was a massive risk. A specially outfitted medical plane carried him across the country, with Marie by his side, gripping his hand as if her own will could keep him alive. In Boston, a new chapter began. The Shriners team was renowned not only for their skill but for their compassion. They welcomed David as more than just a patient. They saw him as a child with a future worth fighting for. Yet the work ahead was daunting. His body had become a battlefield of grafts and scars. His skin, what little remained, was stretched tight, restricting movement. His fingers and hands, crucial for any semblance of normal life, had been ravaged by the fire. He faced contractures, the tightening of scar tissue that could leave him permanently disabled if not aggressively treated. And so the therapy began. Each day, David was woken not to the games and play that most children knew, but to the sharp sting of reality. Physical therapists worked to stretch his limbs, forcing movement where his body wanted only to curl in on itself. Splints and braces were applied, holding his arms and legs in painful positions to prevent the scars from locking his body in place. The sessions were brutal, often leaving him in tears, but he endured them, just as he had endured the flames, with a quiet determination that astonished everyone around him. Marie became more than a mother during these months. She became his coach, his cheerleader, his anchor. She coaxed him through exercises, whispered encouragement when he wanted to give up, and celebrated every tiny victory. If he lifted a hand a fraction higher, she praised him as if he'd conquered a mountain. If he managed to sit up longer than before, she clapped softly, filling the sterile room with warmth. Her strength was the fuel that kept him pushing forward. But the emotional toll was immense. At 6 years old, David was beginning to understand that life would never be the same. Mirrors were avoided. When glimpses of his reflection slipped through, confusion and sadness flickered in his eyes. He knew he was different now. He could feel it in every stretch of scarred skin, in the stares of those who visited, in the hushed voices of doctors discussing his future. Marie worried constantly about what the scars would mean for him as he grew. Not only physically, but emotionally. Would children accept him? Would society see beyond the burns? Could he find joy, love, and a sense of belonging in a world that often turned away from those who looked different? These fears haunted her in the quiet of the night. And yet, each morning, she put them aside, greeting her son with the only thing he needed: hope. Outside the hospital walls, the story of David Rothenberg continued to ripple through the world. Donations still poured in. Strangers sent handmade clothes, blankets, and toys. Messages arrived from across the globe, promising prayers and solidarity. Celebrities reached out privately, offering financial support or simple words of encouragement. The boy who had once been just a child from Brooklyn had become a symbol of resilience. His face, now hidden beneath gauze and scars, etched into the conscience of a nation. Meanwhile, in California, the justice system prepared its case against Charles Rothenberg. He had been captured, arrested, and charged with attempted murder. His defense lawyers hinted at mental instability, at desperation, at a man spiraling out of control. But to the public, no explanation was enough. The image of a father walking away from a motel room he had set ablaze with his son inside was burned into the nation's mind. Whatever his excuses, Charles was the villain, David the survivor. But for Marie and David, the courtroom was a distant world. Their reality was measured in inches of progress, in hours of therapy, in nights where survival still hung by a thread. Every day was a choice: to push forward, to fight against the scars that threatened to define him, to believe that life could still hold meaning. And every day, David chose to fight. The corridors of Shriners Burn Institute in Boston were unlike any other hospital. They carried the quiet weight of survival, children who had stared into the fire and lived to tell their stories. Some wore masks of gauze, others bore scars that twisted their skin into maps of pain and endurance. Here, David was no longer alone. He was one among many, part of a community of children and families bound by tragedy and resilience. The doctors wasted no time. David's treatment plan was relentless. More graft surgeries were scheduled, each one an attempt to rebuild his broken skin. In the operating room, surgeons harvested thin layers of tissue from whatever unburned areas remained, sometimes no larger than a postage stamp, and placed them over wounds, hoping they would take. They experimented with cadaver grafts with artificial coverings, with anything that could provide a barrier against infection. For every success, there were setbacks, grafts that failed, infections that forced removal, complications that left him weakened. The procedures left David exhausted. His body, still fragile from the initial trauma, endured wave after wave of invasive surgeries. Yet even in recovery, there was no rest. Physical therapy sessions pushed him to the edge of what a child could tolerate. Therapists bent his arms and legs against the pull of contracting scar tissue, stretching him until he cried out in pain. Marie often had to look away, tears brimming in her own eyes, but she never let him see her falter. She knew that every scream, every tear, was part of his fight for mobility, for independence, for a life beyond the confines of a bed. Emotionally, the journey was just as brutal. David was beginning to ask questions: why his body looked the way it did, why people stared, why he couldn't run and play like he used to. Marie struggled to find answers that would comfort him without hiding the truth. She told him he was brave, that he was strong, that he was loved by millions of people around the world. But inside, she wrestled with grief. She mourned the boy he had been, the smooth skin, the boundless energy, the innocence untouched by cruelty. And she feared for the boy he was becoming, a child marked forever by fire. The staff at Shriners worked not only on his body but on his spirit. They brought toys into his room, encouraged him to draw, to play, to remember that he was still a child despite the bandages and machines. Volunteers came in to read stories. Therapists used games as tools for movement, turning painful exercises into competitions. Slowly, moments of childhood crept back in, a laugh during a game, a sparkle in his eyes when he beat a therapist at a challenge, the faint beginnings of joy that had once seemed lost forever. One of the most profound challenges was confronting his reflection. Mirrors had been avoided since the fire, but eventually, the day came when he caught sight of himself. His face, once round and full of life, was now scarred and reshaped by surgeries. His skin, mottled and uneven, bore the permanent signature of the flames. First, he recoiled. He turned away, burying his face in his mother's arm. But in time, guided by therapists and Marie's gentle reassurance, he began to face it. The boy in the mirror was not the same as before, but he was alive and he was still David. The media continued to follow his story. Reporters camped outside the hospital, eager for updates. Marie gave interviews when she could, her voice steady as she spoke about his courage, about the importance of burn awareness, about the outpouring of support that had sustained them. She never spoke of her own exhaustion, her sleepless nights, her fears that crept in when the cameras were gone. To the world, she was the rock. To David, she was simply mommy, always by his side, her love a shield against the darkness. Back in California, Charles Rothenberg's legal case trudged forward. He faced charges of attempted murder, child abuse, and arson. His defense tried to paint him as a desperate man, suicidal and overwhelmed, who had made a terrible mistake. But the evidence told another story. A man who bought kerosene, who drugged his son, who lit a match and walked away. Public opinion was merciless. He was branded a monster, and no courtroom plea could erase the image of what he had done. David, meanwhile, was proving that survival was not just about clinging to life, but about reclaiming it. Each painful step in therapy, each hesitant laugh, each attempt to hold a crayon was a defiance of what his father had tried to take from him. He was no longer just a victim of fire. He was becoming a survivor in every sense of the word. Marie often reflected on the paradox of their journey. The fire had destroyed so much, and yet, in its aftermath, it had revealed something extraordinary. The depth of her son's courage, the boundless capacity of strangers to care, the possibility of hope even in the ashes of despair. As summer turned to fall, David remained in Boston, enduring surgery after surgery, therapy after therapy. Progress was slow, sometimes agonizingly so, but it was progress nonetheless. He could sit up longer. He could move his arms with more strength. He was beginning to communicate more clearly, his eyes bright with determination even when his body resisted. And so, in the sterile rooms of Shriners, surrounded by doctors, nurses, therapists, and the unwavering love of his mother, David's new life began to take shape. Scarred, yes, but undeniably alive. The courtroom in Orange County, California, was packed. Journalists filled the benches, their notebooks poised. Cameras waited outside, broadcasting updates to a public hungry for every detail. The name Charles Rothenberg had become infamous, whispered with disgust across America. Now, the man at the center of the nation's outrage was finally facing justice. Marie was not in the courtroom that first day. She remained in Boston with David, unwilling to leave his side. Her boy was still enduring surgeries, still trapped in the grueling schedule of grafts and therapy. But she followed the trial through phone calls with prosecutors, reporters, and friends. For her, the case was not about legal maneuvering or headlines. It was about the truth being spoken aloud, about the world acknowledging the horror of what Charles had done. Charles entered the courtroom in shackles, but his demeanor was strangely calm. He looked less like a man tormented by guilt and more like one who still believed he could talk his way out of consequences. He had lived his entire adult life skating along the edges of law and order, charming his way into jobs, lying his way out of accountability. But this was different. The world had seen what he'd done. There was no escape. The charges were severe: attempted murder, aggravated mayhem, child endangerment, and arson. The prosecution laid out the story in stark detail. The purchase of kerosene, the pill given to David, the flames that consumed the motel room, the witnesses who saw Charles drive away as his son screamed inside. It was cold, calculated, deliberate. This was not desperation. This was intent. The defense, however, attempted another narrative. They painted Charles as a man unraveling, suicidal, unstable, consumed by despair. They argued that he had not intended to kill David, but rather to end his own life, and that in his twisted state, he had made a terrible mistake. They suggested he had tried to save his son after the fire started, that he had panicked, that his actions were those of a broken man rather than a monster. But the evidence was damning. Witness after witness described what they saw. Charles calmly leaving the room, placing the kerosene jug in the trash, driving away at high speed. There was no sign of a man trying to save his child. There was only abandonment, cold and deliberate. The most powerful evidence was not in words, but in the very existence of David himself. Photographs of the boy, his body swathed in bandages, his small frame ravaged by burns, were shown to the court. The images silenced the room. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Reporters stopped scribbling. Even the defense attorneys lowered their eyes. There was no escaping the reality of what had been done. For the prosecution, it was simple. Charles had tried to murder his son. That David had survived was not because of his father's hesitation or remorse, but in spite of it, because strangers had risked their lives to pull him from the fire, because doctors had worked around the clock to keep him alive, because a 6-year-old boy had refused to die. As the trial dragged on, the media coverage intensified. Headlines screamed of betrayal, of horror, of the unimaginable act of a father turning against his child. Public anger was palpable. To most Americans, there was no punishment severe enough for what Charles had done. But the law had its limits. Prosecutors knew the challenge ahead. Juries often wrestled with cases involving intent. Charles's defense leaned heavily on the idea of emotional instability, trying to blur the line between premeditation and breakdown. The question loomed: would the court see him as a calculating criminal or as a man so lost in despair that he deserved a lesser sentence? For Marie, none of it mattered. No courtroom could undo the fire. No sentence could erase the scars etched into her son's body. What mattered was that the truth was spoken, that the world knew David had not been a victim of accident or circumstance, but of deliberate cruelty. And so, as the trial pressed on, the weight of justice hung heavy. The trial of Charles Rothenberg lasted weeks, but from the very beginning, its outcome seemed inevitable. The evidence was too strong, the crime too shocking, the victim too visible. Yet still, the legal process had to run its course. Witnesses came forward one by one. The motel guest who had seen Charles carry the kerosene jug and drive away testified with quiet certainty. Fire investigators described the intensity of the blaze, the deliberate spread of accelerant across the room. The paramedics recalled their desperate rush to save a child whose body was charred black. And then came the photographs. Clinical, undeniable images of David in the burn ward. His small frame wrapped in bandages. His skin red and raw where it still existed. The jury studied them in silence. Some looked away. The defense tried to counter. They called psychiatrists who testified about Charles's fragile state of mind, about his history of depression, about his supposed suicidal intentions. They argued that he had been a broken man who had acted out of despair, not malice. But every word was undercut by the cold facts. He had poured kerosene, lit a match, and left his son behind. Despair might explain his state of mind, but it did not absolve his actions. Marie followed the proceedings from Boston, speaking often with prosecutors by phone. She refused to let the courtroom pull her away from David's bedside, but she also refused to remain silent. In interviews, she was direct and unwavering. "He tried to kill my son," she told reporters. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her words carried weight. They reminded the public that behind the legal language, behind the motions and objections, there was a boy who still woke up screaming from nightmares, who still endured pain every day because of what his father had done. The jury deliberated for only a short time. When they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty. Charles Rothenberg was convicted on multiple charges, including attempted murder and aggravated mayhem. He showed little visible reaction as the words were read. The man who had once strutted with charm now sat hollow, stripped of the illusions he had built around himself. At sentencing, the courtroom brimmed with tension. Prosecutors pushed for the maximum penalty, arguing that this was not just a crime but an atrocity, a father's betrayal at its most unimaginable extreme. The defense pleaded for leniency, citing Charles's mental state, his supposed remorse. But the judge was unmoved. Charles Rothenberg was sentenced to 13 years in prison, the maximum allowed under California law at the time. For many, it felt inadequate. To the public, no number of years could equal the pain inflicted on David. For Marie, the sentence was almost irrelevant. 13 years, she told a reporter. But my son has a lifetime. Indeed, David's sentence was not one handed down by a judge, but by fire. His days were filled with surgeries and therapy, his future bound to the scars that covered his body. Justice, if it existed, was not in a prison term but in the fact that David had survived, that despite his father's attempt to destroy him, he was still here, still fighting. The verdict did bring some closure. The headlines declared victory for justice. The public cheered the conviction. But beneath the relief, there was unease. Many questioned how a man could do such a thing and face only 13 years behind bars. Laws would later change, influenced in part by this case, to allow harsher sentences for such crimes. But in 1983, this was the extent of the law's reach. In Boston, David remained unaware of much of the courtroom drama. His world was smaller, defined by nurses, doctors, and his mother's hand in his. Yet, in a way, the verdict echoed even there. It was a message that the world had not turned away, that people had seen what had been done to him, and that, at least symbolically, justice had spoken. Marie carried that message to her son. Sitting at his bedside, she whispered, "He can't hurt you anymore. He's gone now." Whether David fully understood at 6 years old didn't matter. What mattered was that he saw in his mother's eyes a promise. The man who betrayed him would never again have the chance. The trial of Charles Rothenberg had ended, but for David, the fight was far from over. While the man who tried to destroy him sat in a prison cell, David remained in a hospital bed, his body still a landscape of scars and grafts, his future uncertain. The headlines had shifted, but his daily battles continued, silent, relentless, unseen by the cameras that once swarmed his story. At the Shriners Burns Institute in Boston, life moved according to a strict rhythm of surgeries and therapy. For David, the days blurred together. Anesthesia, scalpels, recovery, and then the endless stretching of limbs to prevent his body from curling into the rigid hold of scar tissue. The pain was constant, the exhaustion overwhelming. Yet his spirit refused to surrender. One of the greatest hurdles came in the form of mobility. Scar tissue tightened around his joints, threatening to rob him of movement. To fight this, doctors and therapists forced him through exercises that felt more like torture than healing. His arms were lifted and extended, his legs bent and stretched, his hands pried open against their will. Marie sat by his side, whispering encouragement as he cried and begged for it to stop. "Just one more, sweetheart. You can do this," she told him, even when it broke her heart to say it. Small victories became monumental. The first time he was able to sit up unassisted, Marie wept with joy. The first time he stood, with braces holding his fragile frame, the staff clapped as if he had climbed a mountain. These moments were lifelines, proof that the boy inside the bandages was still fighting to reclaim the world that had been stolen from him. Emotionally, the journey was just as brutal. David was becoming more aware of his scars, of the way his reflection no longer matched the boy he remembered. When children from other wards passed by, he saw their stares, their hesitation. He understood, even at 6 years old, that he was different. Marie worked tirelessly to remind him that he was still loved, still special, still David. But she knew the scars ran deeper than the skin. Therapists introduced creative outlets, drawing, painting, storytelling, as ways to give David control over his world. With his small, bandaged hands, he clutched crayons and sketched simple shapes, often of houses, cars, and smiling faces. Sometimes he drew fire, orange scribbles across a page, black lines that seemed to consume everything. These drawings were windows into his mind, glimpses of the trauma that words could not yet express. Despite the darkness, joy found its way in. Volunteers brought in toys, books, and even entertainers. Clowns and magicians performed in the ward, coaxing smiles from children who had forgotten how to laugh. For David, these visits were escapes, brief reminders that life could still hold delight. Marie noticed how his eyes lit up during these moments, how the heaviness lifted even if only for an hour. Outside the hospital, David's story continued to resonate. Though the trial was over, the public's fascination remained. Letters still arrived daily. Some were from children who wrote simply, "Get well soon, David. You are my hero." Others came from adults who confessed that his strength had inspired them to face their own struggles. For Marie, reading these messages was bittersweet. She was grateful for the love, but she also knew her son bore a burden no child should ever carry, the burden of being a symbol. Marie herself was undergoing a transformation. Once a private woman, she had become a public figure by necessity. Reporters sought her out, advocacy groups invited her to speak, and strangers stopped her to express sympathy. She handled it with grace, but inside, she was exhausted. Her life was now divided between David's bedside and the world outside that demanded a voice. She chose to use that voice not for anger, but for awareness, about child abuse, about burn victims, about resilience in the face of horror. If her son's suffering could help others, she reasoned, then perhaps something good could be salvaged from the flames. Yet, even as Marie found strength in advocacy, she struggled privately. Nights were the hardest. When the ward was quiet and David finally slept, she allowed herself to cry. She mourned not only what had happened, but what the future might hold. The teasing, the stares, the isolation her son would inevitably face. She wondered if he would ever feel normal again, if he would find friends who could see beyond the scars, if he would grow into a man with confidence and hope. These fears haunted her, but she never let them reach David. To him, she was unwavering, her strength a wall against despair. As the months passed, David began to make slow but steady progress. His lungs grew stronger. His body accepted more grafts. He regained movement in his arms and legs, though limited. Most importantly, he began to smile more. Not just at magicians and toys, but at his mother, at nurses, at the small victories he achieved each day. The smile was crooked, framed by scars, but it was his, and it meant the world. In those moments, it was clear, David Rothenberg was not defined by the fire. He was defined by his fight. By late 1983, David had already endured more than most people face in a lifetime. Yet even amid the surgeries, the therapy, and the endless hospital days, he began to carve out a rhythm of resilience. He was not simply a patient anymore. He was learning how to be a boy again. A boy whose childhood was fractured but not destroyed. One of the biggest milestones came when David began to walk again. His legs were bound by braces, his steps slow and stiff, but the first time he moved down the hospital hallway without being carried, the staff erupted into applause. Marie walked beside him, tears streaming freely, her hand hovering just inches from his back in case he faltered. He was shaky, unsteady, but he was moving under his own power, a declaration that the fire had not stolen his independence. Soon, therapy sessions began to resemble something closer to play. Therapists designed games that encouraged him to reach higher, to stretch further, to balance longer. Sometimes he grew frustrated, collapsing into tears when his body wouldn't obey. Other times, he grinned with triumph, proud of every inch of progress. These were not just exercises. They were battles won against the scars that tried to hold him prisoner. David's personality, once buried under pain and trauma, began to shine through again. He cracked jokes with nurses, teased his therapists, and developed a mischievous sense of humor that made him a favorite on the ward. "Our little comedian," one nurse called him, as he pulled faces behind doctors' backs or exaggerated his groans during therapy just to make others laugh. His laughter, though sometimes raspy and short-lived, became a source of light for everyone around him. Outside the hospital walls, David's story was still headline news. Reporters continued to publish updates, and his name was mentioned often in conversations about child abuse, burn treatment, and justice. Donations kept flowing, ensuring that his care was fully funded. But more importantly, his story was inspiring a movement. Advocacy groups used his case to highlight the needs of burn victims, and his survival became a rallying point for those who believed in the power of human resilience. Marie, once reluctant to stand before microphones, became a voice for her son. She attended events, gave interviews, and lent her story to causes that could help other families. She spoke of David not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a beacon of courage. "He's teaching all of us," she said in one interview. "He's showing us what it means to fight for life." But in private, she still wrestled with the weight of it all. The attention was both a blessing and a burden. She knew the world saw David as a hero, but she also saw the boy who still woke up in pain, who sometimes asked why this had happened to him, who still flinched at the memory of fire. She worried about the years ahead, how he would navigate school, friendships, and the simple cruelty of children who might not understand. Her fears were endless, but so was her determination. She vowed that David would never face those battles alone. The hospital became a kind of home, its staff an extended family. Holidays were celebrated in the ward, with decorations and small parties. Birthdays were marked with cakes, songs, and gifts from strangers who had never met David but felt connected to his journey. In these moments, there was laughter, warmth, and a glimpse of normalcy. David himself began to express dreams of the future. He talked about wanting to play baseball again, about wanting to draw better pictures, about wanting to be strong like the superheroes he admired. His imagination became a lifeline, a way to look beyond the hospital walls and into a life that still held promise. Through it all, the scars remained. They were permanent, a map of pain etched across his body. But instead of being only a reminder of what had been lost, they slowly began to take on a different meaning. To those who knew him, the scars were proof of survival, of battles fought and won. They told a story not of tragedy, but of triumph. By the end of that year, David Rothenberg was no longer just the boy who had been burned by his father. He was the boy who lived, the boy who laughed, the boy who walked again, who painted and dreamed, who gave strength to people he would never meet. And in his mother's eyes, he was something even greater, her miracle, her reason, her reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could still be found. For more than a year, the Shriners Burn Institute in Boston had been David's universe. The hallways, the therapy rooms, the faces of doctors and nurses. They formed a cocoon of care, a world where scars were the norm and survival was celebrated daily. But the time eventually came when the question could no longer be delayed. What would life look like outside these walls? Marie had dreaded this moment even as she longed for it. She wanted nothing more than for David to have a home again, a life that wasn't defined by surgery schedules and hospital alarms. Yet she also feared what lay beyond. Inside the hospital, David was surrounded by people who understood his scars, who never looked away, who celebrated him for who he was. Out there, the world was different. Out there, people stared, children pointed, strangers whispered, and Marie knew that no amount of maternal love could shield her son entirely from the harshness of a society that often recoiled from difference. The doctors, however, agreed that David was ready. His body had stabilized. The most critical grafts had been completed, and while more surgeries would be needed in the future, he no longer required constant hospitalization. He could continue therapy as an outpatient. The thought of leaving Boston, of returning to New York, to the city where his life had been so violently split in two, was overwhelming. But Marie steeled herself. If David was ready, she had to be too. The farewell at Shriners was emotional. Nurses and therapists lined the hallway as David was wheeled out, clapping and cheering. Some cried openly. They had poured their hearts into his recovery, and in return, he had given them something just as valuable: inspiration. "You showed us what courage looks like," one nurse whispered as she hugged him. David grinned shyly, his crooked smile lighting up the room one last time. The flight back to New York was quiet. Marie sat with her son, holding his hand as she stared out the window. The skyline that greeted them was familiar yet changed. For Marie, the city carried ghosts, memories of the life they had before, of the fire that had taken everything. But it was also the place where their future had to begin again. Re-entering the world was harder than either of them expected. The first trip outside their apartment was met with stares. Adults tried to mask their reactions, but children did not. Some pointed openly. Others whispered to their parents, loud enough for David to hear. Marie's heart broke with every glance, but David surprised her. Instead of shrinking away, he stared back, his eyes steady. There was defiance in his small frame, a refusal to hide. School was another challenge. Marie agonized over whether to enroll him in a regular classroom or pursue alternative options. Ultimately, she believed David deserved as normal a life as possible, so she enrolled him in public school. The first days were difficult. Classmates, curious and unfiltered, asked blunt questions. "What happened to your face? Why do you look like that?" Marie had prepared David for this, teaching him simple answers. "My dad hurt me," he would say quietly. Or when he wanted to end the conversation, "I got burned, but I'm okay now." Some children pulled away, uncertain how to react. But others were drawn to him, not out of pity, but out of genuine curiosity and, in some cases, admiration. David's sense of humor helped. He joked about being a superhero with battle scars, a line that made even skeptical kids laugh. Slowly, friendships formed. They weren't easy, and not all lasted, but each connection was proof that David could still belong. At home, life was a delicate balance between normalcy and ongoing care. Therapy sessions continued daily. Marie helped him with stretching exercises, splint adjustments, and mobility drills. She became adept at managing his medical needs, seamlessly blending them into their routine. But she also made sure that home wasn't just another ward. She decorated his room with posters of superheroes and musicians, filled the shelves with books and toys, and insisted on family dinners at the table, no matter how small or imperfect. Marie herself struggled with the shift. In the hospital, she had been surrounded by a community of parents and staff who understood her journey. At home, the isolation set in. Friends tried to be supportive, but few truly grasped the weight of raising a child so profoundly scarred by violence. She carried her fears quietly, pouring her energy into David while often neglecting her own needs. But even in exhaustion, she remained unwavering. Her son's survival was her mission, and she would not falter. Meanwhile, the public's fascination with David did not fade. Invitations arrived for television interviews, charity events, and public appearances. Marie was cautious, wary of turning her son into a spectacle, but she also recognized the power of his story. David had already inspired countless people, and if sharing his journey could help others, whether burn victims, abused children, or families in crisis, then perhaps it was worth the exposure. And so, slowly, David began to step into the public eye. His first appearances were shy, his voice quiet, but the effect was profound. People saw not just scars, but resilience. They saw a boy who had every reason to give up but had chosen instead to fight. The world outside was not easy. It was filled with stares and whispers, with challenges both physical and emotional. But David was proving, day by day, that he could live in it, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The transition back into the world was not just about school and home life. It was also about the unavoidable reality that David was now a public figure. The boy who had survived fire was, in the eyes of many, a symbol of resilience. For Marie, this dual identity, her son as both child and icon, was a constant balancing act. The media requests didn't stop. Television producers wanted David on their shows, newspapers asked for exclusive interviews, and advocacy groups hoped to feature him at fundraising events. At first, Marie hesitated. She worried about exposing him to further scrutiny, about letting strangers into their lives when privacy was already so fragile. But as she considered the impact his story could have, she began to see an opportunity. If sharing David's journey could bring attention to child abuse and burn awareness, perhaps it could help prevent another tragedy. The first appearances were tentative. David, still shy and adjusting to his new reality, sat close to his mother during interviews. He answered questions in short sentences, his voice quiet but clear. When asked about the fire, he rarely elaborated, but when asked about the future, his answers were filled with childlike hope. "I want to play baseball again," he told one interviewer. "I want to draw better. I want to be strong." Those words struck audiences deeply. They saw not just a victim, but a boy with dreams, with determination. And audiences responded. Letters poured in, donations increased, and people lined up at events just to shake Marie's hand or offer encouragement to David. He was no longer just a story in the newspaper. He was real, a living reminder of both cruelty and resilience. Yet the attention was a double-edged sword. For every kind word, there were moments of exploitation. Some media outlets sensationalized his scars, plastering close-up images across their pages without sensitivity. Some interviewers probed too deeply, asking David questions no child should have to answer. Marie learned quickly to be protective, to set boundaries, to walk away when the line between awareness and spectacle was crossed. David himself handled it with surprising grace. Though the stares still hurt, though the whispers still stung, he began to carry himself with a quiet confidence. He developed a way of meeting people's eyes directly, of refusing to shrink from their reactions. In time, he even began to use humor to disarm them. "I'm like a superhero," he once told a group of kids who were staring too long. "Except my costume doesn't come off." The line made them laugh, and for David, that laugh was a victory. Marie, meanwhile, was finding her voice as an advocate. She spoke passionately about the importance of protecting children, about the need for stronger support systems for burn victims and their families. Her words carried weight not just because of her eloquence, but because of her lived experience. She wasn't speaking from statistics or policy papers. She was speaking as the mother of a boy who had walked through fire and lived to tell about it. At home, David's journey toward normalcy continued in small but meaningful ways. He went to birthday parties, though he sometimes stayed close to the edges of the room. He played video games with friends, laughing as if the hospital had never existed. He drew pictures of superheroes and rocket ships, sometimes even sketching himself among them. These glimpses of ordinary childhood were precious, reminders that despite the extraordinary circumstances, David was still, at his core, a boy who wanted to laugh, play, and dream. Of course, challenges remained. Surgeries were still part of his future, each one a painful reminder of the past. Nightmares still woke him in the dark hours, his cries echoing through their home. There were days when the weight of his reality pressed too heavily on his small shoulders, when he asked questions that Marie struggled to answer. But there were also days of laughter, of progress, of hope. The world would never look at David Rothenberg without seeing the scars. But slowly, he was teaching the world to see something more, to see courage, resilience, and the refusal to be defined by tragedy. Childhood is supposed to be a time of discovery, of scraped knees and playground games, of learning who you are in the small, everyday adventures of growing up. For David Rothenberg, childhood was all of that, but layered with surgeries, therapy sessions, and the weight of a story that followed him everywhere he went. By the mid-1980s, David was no longer just the boy in the hospital headlines. He was a child navigating the world with scars that could not be hidden and a past that could not be erased. Each new year brought its own mix of medical necessity and personal milestones. Doctors continued to schedule grafts, reconstructive surgeries, and procedures to expand his mobility. These were not optional. Without them, scar tissue would tighten and cripple him further. But each surgery also stole pieces of childhood. Weeks in hospitals, months of recovery, endless cycles of pain. Yet, amid those intrusions, David grew. He learned to ride a bike, carefully at first, balancing with determination despite the stiffness in his joints. He discovered music, tapping out rhythms on whatever surface was nearby. He developed opinions about baseball teams and television shows, about toys and school subjects, about the things all children debate with their friends. His scars might have set him apart, but his interests anchored him to the ordinary world of being a boy. School was never easy, but David handled it with the same courage he showed in hospitals. The questions from classmates never fully stopped. New students, seeing him for the first time, often stared. Some avoided him out of discomfort. Others approached with blunt curiosity. "Did it hurt?" they asked. "Why do you look like that?" David learned how to answer without hesitation, giving short, matter-of-fact replies. Sometimes he even turned their curiosity into connection. "It hurt a lot," he'd say, "but I lived. Pretty cool, right?" That confidence made some kids admire him, turned strangers into friends. Marie continued to be both mother and shield. She hovered when needed, stepping in when cruelty surfaced, but she also allowed David space to grow. She understood that he couldn't be protected from everything, that he needed to find his own ways of navigating the world. Still, she never stopped worrying. Every playground scuffle, every whisper behind his back, every sideways glance cut her deeply. But she also marveled at her son's resilience. He was not just surviving. He was carving out a place for himself in a world that wasn't built to welcome children like him. Public life continued to shadow their private one. David's story remained in the news, sometimes resurfacing in anniversary coverage or features on survival. He was invited to speak at events, sometimes alongside Marie, sometimes on his own. These appearances gave him a platform, but they also put pressure on him to be more than just a boy. He was expected to inspire, to embody resilience, to be a symbol. Times it was empowering. At other times it was exhausting. David's art began to reflect this complexity. As he grew older, his drawings moved beyond simple shapes. He sketched bold lines, abstract images filled with color and emotion. Some depicted fire and rebirth. Others showed superheroes standing tall against impossible odds. Art became not just a pastime, but a language, a way to express the things words could not capture. Marie encouraged it, seeing in his work both a release and a glimpse of the man he might one day become. The surgeries remained relentless. Each time he built momentum, at school, with friends, in hobbies, another procedure loomed. He hated the hospital smell, the endless pokes of needles, the grogginess of anesthesia. Yet he faced each operation with a mix of dread and determination. "One more, Mom," he would say. "Just one more." He learned early that progress often meant pain, but that progress was worth it. By the time he was 10, David had endured dozens of surgeries. But he had also endured playground games, sleepovers with friends, laughter-filled birthday parties, and late-night talks with his mother about dreams and fears. His scars were permanent, but so was his spirit. And slowly, the world began to see him not just as the boy who had been burned, but as a child growing into himself. As David entered his preteen years, the duality of his life became sharper. On one hand, he was a boy like any other, caught up in the rhythms of school, friendships, and the early stirrings of independence. On the other, he was still tethered to hospitals, headlines, and the unshakable reality of his scars. The media attention never truly faded. Every so often, a journalist would revisit his story, marking anniversaries of the fire or updating the public on his progress. Some of these features painted him as a miracle child, others as a tragic figure, but none could capture the fullness of who he was becoming. David was aware of it, aware that the world saw him through a narrow lens, and he began to push back. "I'm not just the boy who got burned," he once told a reporter. "I'm David." Marie supported him in this fight for identity. She was fiercely protective, but she also knew she couldn't, and shouldn't, shield him from everything. Instead, she gave him tools. She taught him how to answer intrusive questions with confidence, how to assert himself when people reduced him to his scars, and how to lean on humor when the weight of attention became too heavy. Humor, in fact, became one of David's defining traits. He discovered that laughter could disarm discomfort, that a well-timed joke could shift a room's energy. When classmates asked awkward questions, he sometimes made light of it. "Yeah, I'm different. I make fire look bad." The line usually earned chuckles, and with those chuckles came acceptance. Humor gave him control in situations where he might otherwise feel powerless. At home, art remained his sanctuary. His drawings grew bolder, his colors more intense. Marie noticed that his art often carried themes of transformation. Flames turning into light, broken figures finding strength, monsters standing tall. It was as though he was rewriting his own story on paper, taking back ownership of the fire and reshaping it into symbols of resilience. But alongside creativity and humor, there was also anger. David began to grapple with the truth of what had happened. Not just the fire itself, but the betrayal. His father, the man who should have protected him, had been the one to cause his suffering. At first, David asked questions in hushed tones. "Why did he do it? Did he want me to die?" Marie answered as honestly as she could, never sugarcoating but never overwhelming him. As he grew older, the anger became sharper, more vocal. He hated his father for what had been taken from him, for the pain that never seemed to end. Marie let him express that anger, knowing it was part of healing. In the public eye, David's resilience became a beacon. He appeared at events for burn survivors, standing alongside adults who had endured similar traumas. Though he was young, his presence carried weight. People saw in him not just a child, but living proof that survival was possible, that life could continue even after unimaginable cruelty. For other children in burn wards, David was a hero. For their parents, he was a symbol of hope. Yet Marie never let the public pedestal replace her son's humanity. At home, she insisted on normalcy, chores, homework, family dinners. She wanted David to know that he was more than his scars, more than his story, more than the headlines. And he was mischievous, stubborn, creative, funny, sometimes moody, always resilient. By the time he reached his early teens, David had endured more than most adults could fathom. He had undergone dozens of surgeries, faced ridicule and admiration in equal measure, and carried the knowledge of a betrayal that could have broken him. But instead of breaking, he adapted. He learned to laugh, to create, to connect. He learned to live. Adolescence is rarely easy for anyone. It's a time of searching, of awkward growth, of testing boundaries and discovering who you want to become. For David Rothenberg, adolescence came layered with additional challenges. The permanence of scars, the shadows of trauma, and the unrelenting curiosity of a world that thought it knew him. By the time David entered his teenage years, he had already endured more than most people do in a lifetime. Yet the challenges ahead were no longer just medical or physical. They were emotional, social, and deeply personal. He was old enough now to feel the full weight of what had been taken from him, old enough to understand the betrayal of his father, old enough to grasp that his life would always be different. School remained both a refuge and a battlefield. His intelligence and humor won him friends, but his scars continued to draw unwanted attention. Teenagers could be cruel, even when they didn't mean to be. Some mocked him openly. Others avoided him out of discomfort. Yet David, increasingly confident, began to push back. He refused to hide. He wore his scars like armor, challenging others to see beyond them. Still, there were nights when he came home defeated, collapsing into Marie's arms with tears he rarely showed in public. The tension between who he wanted to be and how the world saw him gnawed at him. Marie held him through those moments, whispering the same words she had said since the earliest days of his survival. "You are more than this. You are David." The anger toward his father intensified during these years. Adolescence sharpened his questions into accusations. "He knew what he was doing," David said bitterly. "He wanted me gone. He didn't care." The betrayal was not abstract anymore. It was personal, visceral, shaping his sense of trust and his view of family. Marie, though careful never to drown him in bitterness, did not deny his feelings. She knew he needed to face the truth head-on, to grapple with the enormity of what had been done to him. Amid the turbulence, creativity continued to anchor him. Art became more than an outlet. It became a passion. His drawings grew darker, more complex, filled with bold strokes and surreal imagery. Fire still appeared in his work, but often alongside symbols of transformation: wings, light, rebirth. It was as though he was rewriting his own mythology, turning pain into power through ink and paint. Music also found a place in his life. He discovered bands and sounds that spoke to his anger, his resilience, his yearning to belong. He played music loudly in his room, filling the walls with rhythms that drowned out silence. Music gave him energy, identity, and connection to peers who shared his tastes, even if they couldn't share his scars. Marie, for her part, walked the fine line between mother and advocate with even greater care. She continued to speak publicly when necessary, but she tried to shield David from the weight of expectation. She wanted him to have the freedom to define himself, not to feel like he had to live up to the image the world had built around him. Yet, inevitably, the public gaze intruded. Interviews, events, and reminders of his story still surfaced, forcing David to balance who he was privately with who people thought he should be. Romance and identity added new layers of complexity. As David grew, he began to notice girls, and to wonder if they noticed him. The scars made him self-conscious in ways he hadn't been as a child. Questions of attractiveness, of being accepted, of being loved weighed heavily. He confided in Marie sometimes, but often kept his insecurities to himself, wrestling with them in the quiet of his room. Through it all, one truth remained constant. David refused to be broken. He had survived fire, hospitals, surgeries, and stares. Now he was surviving adolescence. Messy, complicated, often painful, but also full of potential. His journey was no longer only about survival. It was about becoming. As David moved further into his teenage years, the tug-of-war between private life and public identity became more intense. On one side, he wanted to be like any other teen, going to the mall, listening to music, sketching in his notebooks, arguing with his mom about curfews and chores. On the other, he could never escape being that boy, the one whose father set him on fire, the one people recognized from newspapers and television. The media had a way of intruding even when David wanted nothing to do with it. Every few years, another article would surface, often timed to coincide with court hearings involving his father or milestones in his recovery. David hated those reminders. Each story, no matter how well-meaning, dragged his past into the present, forcing him to relive memories he would rather leave behind. "They don't know me," he would say bitterly to Marie. "They just know the fire." Marie understood, but she also reminded him that his story had power, that by speaking he could help others. Sometimes David agreed, embracing the role of survivor, standing before audiences and telling them that life after tragedy was possible. Other times, he resented the weight of it. He wanted to be David, not a symbol. Independence became a central theme of his adolescence. After years of hospitals and therapy, of being defined by what had been done to him, David longed to assert control over his own life. He experimented with his style, trying out new clothes, new hairstyles, small rebellions that felt monumental. He pushed against Marie's protective instincts, craving freedom but still relying on her stability. Their bond remained strong, but like all teenagers and mothers, theirs was punctuated by arguments, slammed doors, and reconciliations. The scars, always present, complicated everything. They made him stand out in ways he didn't want, yet over time he began to see them differently. Instead of only reminders of pain, they became symbols of survival. When people stared, David sometimes met their gaze and refused to look away. "Yeah, I look different," he once told a classmate, "but I'm still here. Can you say that about what you've been through?" That defiance, that refusal to apologize for his existence, became part of his identity. Relationships were complicated but not impossible. Some peers kept their distance, unsure how to interact with someone so visibly scarred. But others were drawn to his humor, his creativity, his honesty. He made friends who saw beyond the surface, who valued him for his spirit rather than his appearance. Romantic interest was trickier. His self-doubt often kept him from pursuing it fully, but he began to realize that acceptance was possible, that love was not beyond reach. Art continued to be his refuge. His sketches and paintings grew more ambitious, his style more distinct. Teachers noticed his talent and encouraged him to pursue it seriously. For David, art was more than expression, it was liberation. On paper, he could create worlds where scars didn't matter, where monsters were defeated, where fire became light. It was a way to reshape reality, to take control of a story that had once been forced upon him. Music, too, remained central. He connected with bands whose lyrics spoke of pain, rebellion, and resilience. Their songs became anthems, soundtracks to his late-night reflections and early-morning battles with insecurity. In music, as in art, David found belonging, a reminder that even if his story was unique, his emotions were universal. By the time David approached the end of his teenage years, he was no longer just the boy who survived fire. He was a young man, shaped by trauma but not defined by it, scarred but strong, angry yet hopeful. He had lived through betrayal, through pain, through the scrutiny of strangers, and he had not only survived but begun to thrive. Adulthood crept in quietly, almost without warning. One day David was a teenager struggling with schoolwork, and the next he was standing on the edge of independence, staring out at a world that had always seemed both hostile and full of possibility. For David Rothenberg, entering young adulthood wasn't simply about turning 18. It was about claiming ownership of a life that had been shaped by others. His father, the media, even the doctors who had rebuilt him, and finally making it his own. The desire for autonomy was strong. After years of relying on Marie for everything, from medical care to emotional support, David wanted to prove that he could stand on his own. It wasn't that he didn't love his mother. Their bond was unshakable, forged in fire and fortified through countless battles. But independence was necessary, both for him and for her. He wanted to show the world and himself that he wasn't fragile, that his survival wasn't the whole story. Practical challenges made independence more complicated. His scars limited mobility, and surgeries were still a recurring necessity. Simple tasks others took for granted, tying shoelaces, lifting heavy objects, even buttoning a shirt, sometimes frustrated him. Yet David's determination outweighed the obstacles. If something was difficult, he worked at it until it became manageable. If it was impossible, he found another way. His creativity extended beyond art. It infused his problem-solving, his resilience, his ability to adapt. Public attention continued to linger, though less intensely than in his childhood. By now, most people who recognized him were adults who remembered the headlines from years before. "You're that boy," strangers would sometimes whisper. David hated the label. He wasn't that boy anymore. He was a man with dreams, ambitions, and a future of his own making. Slowly, he began to push back against the narrative, rebranding himself not as a victim of tragedy, but as an artist, a thinker, a creator. Art became his compass in these years. What had once been a coping mechanism grew into a calling. His paintings took on a raw, expressive energy, filled with bold colors and haunting forms. Fire still appeared in his work, but no longer as destruction alone. It became transformation, flames giving way to rebirth, shadows yielding to light. Viewers who saw his pieces often remarked on the intensity, the sense that each canvas was both a wound and a declaration. For David, art wasn't just about expression. It was about control. He could shape the narrative on his own terms, showing the world what he chose rather than what they expected. In paint, he wasn't the boy whose father tried to kill him. He was the man who had survived and was now creating beauty from the ashes. Marie watched this evolution with pride and a touch of fear. She had spent so many years protecting him, guiding him, ensuring that his life was more than pain. Letting go, even slightly, was difficult, but she knew it was necessary. She encouraged his independence, celebrated his milestones, and supported his art. Yet in quiet moments, she admitted to herself that she worried about his future, his health, his ability to endure in a world that could still be cruel. The question of his father never disappeared. Charles Rothenberg, though largely absent, remained a shadow. David wrestled with that absence, sometimes with anger, sometimes with indifference, sometimes with questions that had no easy answers. Did his father think about him? Did he regret what he had done? Did he even care? These questions lingered, unresolved, and they shaped David's understanding of trust, family, and betrayal. But the truth was that David's adulthood was not his father's story anymore. It was his own. With each passing year, he took steps further from the fire and closer to the man he wanted to be. As David moved deeper into young adulthood, the question shifted from survival to identity. He had lived through fire, endured endless surgeries, and weathered the scrutiny of strangers. But now he faced the same question that haunts most young adults. Who am I, and what am I going to do with my life? For David, the answer kept circling back to art. What began as therapy in his childhood had evolved into something far more serious. His paintings grew larger, more experimental, layered with textures and emotions that were impossible to ignore. Viewers often said his canvases seemed alive, vibrating with both pain and resilience. When David painted, he wasn't just creating. He was speaking a language that bypassed words. He began to show his work publicly, first in small community exhibits, then in larger shows where critics took notice. His name carried a history, of course, the boy who survived the fire, but his art demanded attention on its own. People walked away from his pieces moved, unsettled, inspired. For David, that was the victory. Not that they saw his scars, but that they felt his vision. But art alone didn't define these years. Like many young adults, David sought connection, friendships, relationships, love. His scars complicated things, leaving him vulnerable to rejection and misunderstanding. He worried about intimacy, about whether anyone could look past the physical and see the man he was. At times, those worries isolated him. But gradually, he discovered that his openness, his humor, and his authenticity drew people in. The scars were part of him, yes, but they weren't the whole of him. Marie remained at the center of his world, but their relationship shifted as David asserted more independence. She had spent so long as his protector that stepping back was both painful and necessary. They argued more in these years, often about boundaries, freedom, or his choices. But beneath every clash was an unshakable bond, one forged not just in love, but in survival. They were not simply mother and son. They were comrades who had faced fire together. The media, though quieter, still resurfaced occasionally. Sometimes David embraced it, using interviews or appearances to highlight his art and speak about survival. Other times, he turned away, frustrated by the lingering focus on his father's crime. He wanted to be known for what he was building, not just for what had been destroyed. "I don't want to be remembered as the boy who got burned," he once told an interviewer. "I want to be remembered as the man who created." That defiance, the insistence on defining himself, became a driving force. Whether through paintbrushes, friendships, or public words, David was reclaiming his story. He had been a victim, yes, but he refused to remain one. As his 20s unfolded, David carried his scars with less shame and more ownership. They were not just reminders of pain. They were part of his identity, woven into the fabric of who he was becoming. He didn't hide them. He didn't apologize for them. In a world obsessed with perfection, he embodied imperfection, and through that, authenticity. In his 20s, David stood at a crossroads familiar to many young adults, but with a weight few could imagine. Most of his peers were navigating college, jobs, relationships, and the first shaky steps of independence. David was navigating all of that too, but with the added reality of scars, of media labels, of a childhood carved by fire. Art remained at the heart of his journey. His paintings began to attract real attention, not just from local communities but from galleries and collectors who saw in his work something raw, authentic, and unforgettable. The canvas was where David spoke most honestly, unfiltered by interviews or expectations. In his paintings, he expressed anger, joy, despair, hope, sometimes all in a single piece. His work carried the weight of his survival, but it also transcended it. Viewers didn't just see a victim's art. They saw the vision of a man reshaping pain into beauty. But art was not the only arena where David's voice grew louder. He became increasingly outspoken in public appearances, not as the boy who survived, but as an advocate. He spoke about resilience, about the importance of not allowing trauma to define identity, about the need to protect children from violence. He carried himself with a blunt honesty that disarmed audiences. He didn't sugarcoat his past, but he didn't glorify it either. Instead, he framed it as part of a larger truth, that life after tragedy is messy, complicated, but possible. At the same time, David wrestled with the ordinary challenges of adulthood. Financial independence was not easy. His medical history meant ongoing expenses, and making a living from art was never guaranteed. He took odd jobs when necessary, balancing the need to pay bills with his desire to pursue creativity. These years were marked by hustle, by trial and error, by the stubborn refusal to give up on the life he wanted. Relationships added another layer of complexity. David longed for connection but remained cautious. Trust did not come easily, and self-doubt sometimes held him back. Yet when he did let people in, they often found him magnetic. Funny, sharp, compassionate, and unafraid to speak his mind. His scars, once a barrier, became part of his story, a testament to survival that many found deeply compelling. Marie, though still present in his life, had stepped further back, letting David lead his own path. She watched with pride as he found his footing, but she never stopped worrying. For years she had carried the fear of losing him, and that fear never truly vanished. Still, she understood that her son was not just surviving anymore. He was living, building, becoming. The shadow of his father remained, but by now David rarely spoke of him. When asked in interviews, he was blunt. "He doesn't matter. He's not part of my life." For David, the fire had once been the defining event. But now, adulthood gave him the power to redefine the story. His father had tried to destroy him, but David was busy creating. There were setbacks, of course. Art shows that didn't sell. Relationships that faltered. Days when the weight of the past felt too heavy. But there were also victories. Paintings that moved audiences to tears. Speeches that inspired survivors. Friendships that endured. David was, in many ways, learning the same lesson all young adults do. That life is a patchwork of failure and success, pain and joy, all stitched together into something that resembles progress. Through it all, one truth held steady. David refused to be invisible. His scars made him stand out, but his spirit made him unforgettable. He was no longer the boy in the hospital bed, nor just the teenager fighting for acceptance. He was a man stepping into his own, unapologetically visible, defiantly alive. By his late 20s, David had grown into the role of both artist and advocate, though he continued to resist labels that boxed him into one narrative. He didn't want to be seen solely as a burn survivor or a victim, nor did he want to be cast exclusively as a symbol of resilience. He wanted to be seen as a whole person, complex, flawed, creative, human. His art career gained momentum in these years. Galleries began to invite him to exhibit, and his work started to attract serious collectors. Critics noted the visceral power of his pieces, abstract yet deeply personal, filled with bold strokes and layered meaning. Fire remained a recurring motif, but not as destruction. Instead, it appeared as transformation, as energy, as light. David's canvases radiated the message that something new could always be created from the ashes of the past. Public speaking became another avenue for his voice. Invitations came from schools, survivor networks, and advocacy organizations. David did not present himself as polished or rehearsed. He spoke bluntly, from the heart, often mixing raw honesty with humor. "People expect me to be angry all the time," he once told an audience. "But anger doesn't build anything, and I'm here to build." His words resonated not because they were perfect, but because they were real. Still, balancing public life with private identity was never easy. Being seen as a symbol carried weight. There were days when David felt exhausted by the expectations placed upon him. To inspire, to represent, to embody resilience. Sometimes he longed to disappear into anonymity, to live quietly without the gaze of strangers. But he also understood the power of his story, and more importantly, the power of his voice. He chose to keep speaking, not because he had to, but because he wanted his survival to mean something larger than himself. Personally, David continued to wrestle with intimacy and trust. His scars, though accepted by many, remained a source of vulnerability for him. He questioned whether people saw him or only the story behind his scars. Yet he also discovered that honesty was his greatest strength. When he allowed people in, when he shared his struggles openly, connections deepened. He was learning, slowly, that love and acceptance were possible, even if they came with risk. Marie, now watching from a greater distance, marveled at the man her son had become. She remembered the fragile child in the hospital bed, covered in bandages, fighting for breath. Now she saw a man standing in front of audiences, commanding attention, creating art that stirred souls. The journey from then to now had been brutal, but it had also been extraordinary. The presence of his father lingered only as a shadow, mostly through the justice system. Charles Rothenberg had served his time, and later, due to repeat offenses unrelated to David, he faced new prison sentences under California's three-strikes law. David rarely spoke of him, except to make clear that his father's actions no longer defined his life. "He tried to end me," David once said in an interview, "but I'm still here. That's my story, not his." By the time David entered his 30s, he had begun to carve out a legacy that was uniquely his. His art was no longer just survival therapy. It was his career, his passion, his way of communicating with the world. His voice, though sometimes reluctant, had become a source of strength for others. And his life, scarred, imperfect, but fiercely lived, was proof that identity could be reclaimed, reshaped, redefined. Turning 30 marked a milestone David once wasn't sure he'd live to see. For a boy whose very survival had been uncertain, adulthood felt like both a victory and a responsibility. The scars remained, the memories remained, but now there was a stronger sense of ownership. This was his life, and he was determined to shape it. In his 30s, David's art took on new depth. What had once been raw expressions of survival evolved into more nuanced explorations of identity, freedom, and transformation. His canvases grew bolder, larger, filled with contrasts of shadow and light. Critics described his style as both haunting and liberating, carrying the unmistakable intensity of lived experience. David himself called it painting my freedom. For him, art was not only about healing anymore. It was about declaring existence, unapologetic, undeniable, and fiercely alive. Exhibitions expanded, drawing larger audiences and more recognition. Some people came because they remembered his story, but many came simply because the art spoke to them. That distinction mattered to David. He wanted to be respected not as a symbol of survival but as a creator in his own right. And slowly he achieved it. His work sold, his reputation grew, and his identity as an artist became inseparable from his identity as a survivor. Yet success did not erase struggle. His health remained fragile, with surgeries and treatments still woven into his life. Each hospital visit was a reminder of the fire's long shadow. Pain was a constant companion, sometimes dull and bearable, other times sharp and overwhelming. But David had long ago learned that pain could coexist with creation. "It's part of me," he said once, "but it doesn't own me." Public speaking also evolved during these years. No longer content to simply recount his survival, David began to speak more broadly about resilience, about the importance of rewriting one's story, about refusing to be defined by trauma. He spoke at schools, art centers, and survivor groups, always with the same blunt honesty. He didn't present himself as a saint or a hero. He presented himself as a man still working through the aftermath, still learning, still flawed. That authenticity made his words powerful. Audiences left not with a polished story, but with a raw truth they could carry into their own lives. Privately, David still wrestled with loneliness. Friendships sustained him, but intimacy remained elusive. Trust was hard-won, and vulnerability even harder. His scars, both visible and invisible, made him hesitant, even when connection was possible. Still, he never stopped hoping. He believed, deeply, that love in some form was possible, even if it didn't arrive in the conventional ways. Marie, watching her son from the vantage point of age, remained both his greatest supporter and his quiet anchor. Their relationship had changed over the years, shifting from protector and child to partners navigating life together. She marveled at the man he had become, the ways he turned pain into beauty. But she also worried, as mothers always do, about his health, his loneliness, his future. Their bond remained unshakable, forged not only in blood, but in the extraordinary journey they had endured together. The shadow of his father, though diminished, never disappeared entirely. News of Charles Rothenberg's later criminal troubles occasionally resurfaced, pulling David's name back into headlines he would rather avoid. But by now, David had learned to face those intrusions with defiance. "He doesn't get to define me," he said. "I'm living my life. He's living his." David's 30s were, in many ways, a decade of reclamation. He was no longer just surviving or even proving himself. He was living deliberately, making choices, building a legacy. His art spoke loudly, his voice reached far, and his presence reminded the world that resilience was not about erasing scars, but about embracing them. As David moved through his 30s, his sense of identity sharpened. He no longer saw himself only as the boy who had survived a horrific act, nor as the teenager struggling to belong. He was a man who had taken the wreckage of his past and built something meaningful from it. Every painting, every speech, every appearance carried the message that survival was not the end of the story. Transformation was. His artwork grew increasingly symbolic. Fire was still a recurring theme, but now it often appeared alongside images of flight, rebirth, and freedom. Wings, suns, broken chains. His canvases spoke of release, of reclaiming power, of transcending pain. Viewers were struck not only by the imagery but by the energy behind it. Critics wrote that his art burned with intensity, yet carried the unmistakable spark of hope. For David, that balance was everything. He wanted people to see not only the scars but the possibilities that could grow from them. His exhibitions expanded beyond local audiences, with pieces traveling into national shows. Collectors valued not only the art itself but the story of the man behind it. That duality, artist and survivor, remained complicated for David. On one hand, he welcomed the recognition. On the other, he bristled at the idea that his work was valuable only because of his past. "I don't want pity," he said in one interview. "I want people to see the art for what it is. The scars are part of me, but they're not the reason I create." Public speaking continued as well, though David became more selective about when and where he spoke. He didn't want to retell the same story endlessly, trapped in the past. Instead, he shifted the focus toward resilience, toward art, toward living authentically. He emphasized that survival was messy and ongoing, not a clean-cut narrative with a happy ending. His refusal to romanticize trauma made his talks strikingly honest. Audiences connected with him because he didn't pretend. He told them the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Privately, life remained complex. Loneliness still surfaced, and there were nights when the silence felt heavy. But David was not without companionship. Friends, collaborators, and supporters surrounded him, forming a network of people who valued him not for what he had endured but for who he was. He leaned on those connections, finding joy in shared laughter, late-night conversations, and creative projects. Marie, aging now, remained a steady presence in his life. Their relationship was less about protection and more about partnership. She was proud, deeply proud, of the man her son had become. Sometimes she admitted to friends that she worried what would happen when she was no longer there. But those worries never eclipsed her admiration. She had raised a fighter, and she knew he would endure. The ghost of his father surfaced occasionally in headlines, as Charles Rothenberg, later known by another name, continued to encounter the law. But David paid little attention. He refused to let his father's failures intrude on his own journey. "That's his story," David would say simply. "This is mine." By the close of his 30s, David had carved out a life that, while unconventional, was deeply authentic. He had transformed tragedy into art, pain into purpose, scars into symbols of resilience. He was not without struggle, no one is, but he was undeniably alive, present, and unafraid to stand before the world exactly as he was. By the time David entered his 40s, the rhythm of his life had settled into something both familiar and extraordinary. He was no longer the child in the headlines, nor the young man struggling to define himself. He was an established artist, a survivor who had transformed his trauma into a lifelong body of work. Yet with this stability came new questions, questions about purpose, about aging, about what it meant to live fully in the time he had. His art had matured along with him. The canvases of his 40s carried a sense of depth and refinement that reflected years of practice and lived experience. While fire and rebirth still appeared, his palette grew broader, his symbols more layered. He began experimenting with new techniques, incorporating mixed media and textures that gave his work a tactile, almost sculptural quality. Critics observed that his art seemed less about raw emotion now and more about meditation, a search for peace, for balance, for transcendence. David often spoke of painting as a dialogue with himself. In his 40s, that dialogue shifted from questions of survival to reflections on legacy. "What will I leave behind?" he asked in interviews. "What will people remember about me when I'm gone?" His answer was always tied to art. He wanted his work to stand not only as a testament to his resilience but as universal expressions of human struggle and hope. Public recognition continued, though David learned to navigate it on his own terms. He gave fewer speeches but more curated, meaningful ones. He appeared at art events, advocacy gatherings, and creative workshops where he could engage directly with people. He was less interested in fame and more interested in connection. "If I can reach one person who feels broken," he once said, "then it's worth it." Privately, life remained layered. Loneliness lingered at times, a quiet ache that surfaced in the stillness of evenings. But friendships, collaborations, and the enduring bond with Marie sustained him. By now, she was aging into her senior years, and the roles between them had begun to shift. David, once the child needing protection, found himself increasingly protective of her. He worried about her health, her comfort, her well-being. Their relationship, forged through fire and rebuilt over decades, deepened into one of profound mutual care. His health challenges continued, as they always had, with flare-ups that required medical attention. Pain was never fully absent, but David had long since learned to live alongside it. Instead of resisting it, he folded it into his understanding of life. "We all carry pain," he said. "Mine just shows on the outside." That perspective gave his words a resonance that struck audiences and friends alike. His father, by this stage, was almost a ghost in his life. Charles Rothenberg's repeated legal troubles and eventual incarceration under California's three-strikes law made headlines from time to time, but David rarely commented. To him, his father was a figure of the past, someone whose choices had once shaped his life but no longer dictated it. "He's gone from my story," David said, What I do now is about me. David's 40s were marked not only by art and reflection but by a growing sense of peace. He had spent decades wrestling with identity, with scars, with the weight of being seen as a symbol. Now, more than ever, he embraced simply being himself, an artist, a son, a man who had endured and chosen to create anyway. As David's 40s progressed, the urgency of youth gave way to a quieter wisdom. He no longer felt the constant need to prove that he could survive or succeed. He had already done both. Now, his focus shifted toward what it meant to live with intention, to find meaning in each day, and to accept both the beauty and fragility of existence. His art reflected this transformation. Where earlier works had pulsed with raw energy, the pieces of his 40s often carried a softer strength. He explored themes of time, memory, and transcendence. His colors grew subtler, his lines more deliberate, as though each stroke was less about reaction and more about reflection. "I'm not painting fire anymore," he told one interviewer. "I'm painting light." Collectors noticed the shift, and so did critics. His exhibitions drew thoughtful praise, with reviewers describing his later work as meditations in color and portraits of resilience distilled into peace. The art world increasingly recognized David not as a survivor who painted, but as an artist whose survival gave his work a rare depth. That distinction mattered deeply to him. Outside of art, David became more selective with his public appearances. He no longer felt compelled to say yes to every request. Instead, he chose opportunities that resonated with his values. Speaking at schools, collaborating on creative projects, or engaging with survivors who drew strength from his journey. He preferred small, intimate settings where he could connect directly rather than large stages where he felt reduced to a symbol. His relationship with Marie remained the core of his private world. By now, she was older, and David found himself reversing roles, watching over her with the same vigilance she had once given him. He cooked for her when he could, reminded her to rest, and cherished the quiet evenings they spent together. Their bond, forged in the aftermath of fire, had weathered decades. It was no longer just mother and son. It was partnership, loyalty, love in its purest form. There were still difficult days. Pain flared unpredictably, sometimes knocking him off balance. Memories resurfaced uninvited, reminding him of nights in the hospital or moments of childhood fear. Loneliness, too, remained a quiet companion. But David had learned to meet these challenges not with despair, but with acceptance. "Life isn't about waiting for things to get easier," he once said. "It's about learning how to carry what you've got and keep moving." As for his father, the world knew Charles Rothenberg's name mostly through the headlines of repeated crimes and eventual incarceration. But for David, his father had long ago ceased to matter. When asked about him, David's response was simple: "He's not my story anymore." And in truth, he wasn't. David's story had become one of creation, resilience, and an unrelenting refusal to be defined by what was done to him. By the close of his 40s, David's life carried a profound sense of wholeness. He was scarred, yes, but also complete. His paintings hung in galleries, his words lingered in the hearts of audiences, and his presence in the world was undeniable. He had faced fire, betrayal, pain, and loneliness, and yet he had built a life that mattered, a life that inspired, a life that endured. Entering his 50s, David carried himself with a quiet authority. The years had etched their own marks on him, but after a lifetime of scars, age did not intimidate him. If anything, it gave him perspective. "Getting older is a privilege," he once said, reflecting on the many moments in his youth when he doubted he would even live to see adulthood. Every birthday was a reminder that he had beaten the odds. His art, now widely respected, reached a stage of profound maturity. In earlier decades, his paintings had carried the urgency of survival, the anger of adolescence, the defiance of early adulthood. In his 50s, the work felt almost spiritual. He explored themes of mortality, continuity, and the cyclical nature of life. Shapes became more fluid, colors more contemplative, as if his canvases were less about fighting the past and more about making peace with it. Collectors and curators increasingly spoke of David not simply as a survivor who became an artist, but as an artist whose body of work stood among the most honest expressions of resilience in contemporary art. Exhibitions framed his paintings within larger narratives about healing, transformation, and the human capacity to endure. For David, this recognition was gratifying, not because of fame or sales, but because his work was finally being seen for its artistry, not only its backstory. But aging came with new challenges. Decades of surgeries and chronic pain had left their toll on his body. Simple movements sometimes felt laborious. Medical appointments remained a fixture in his life, a reminder that the fire of his childhood was never entirely behind him. Yet David approached these struggles with the same stubborn resilience he always had. "Pain is my companion," he once said, "but so is hope, and I choose who I spend more time with." Marie's aging was even more pronounced. By now, in her senior years, she grew increasingly dependent on David's support. Their relationship had reversed roles entirely. She had once carried him through hospitals and heartbreak, and now he carried her through the frailties of age. This shift was not a burden for David. It was a privilege. Caring for his mother gave him purpose, grounding him in gratitude for all the years she had given him. Their bond was unshakable. In private moments, they would sit together in silence, comfortable in each other's presence. No words needed. Sometimes they laughed about memories from decades past. The chaos of hospitals, the absurdity of media attention, the resilience it took just to keep moving forward. Other times, they simply enjoyed the quiet, both knowing how rare and precious their shared time had become. The ghost of his father was all but gone. Charles Rothenberg's later years were spent behind bars, far removed from David's world. When the news of his eventual death surfaced, David's response was muted. "It doesn't change anything," he said softly. "I made peace with him a long time ago, by choosing not to let him matter." With those words, a chapter fully closed. His father's name might remain in the history of crime, but David's story had long since broken free of that shadow. In his 50s, David became less concerned with public visibility and more focused on legacy. He wanted his art to outlive him, to speak for him long after his voice was gone. He organized his work carefully, documented his creative philosophy, and collaborated with galleries to ensure his pieces would remain accessible. He wasn't chasing recognition anymore, he was building permanence. As David moved deeper into his later years, the pace of life slowed, but the richness of it did not. Each day carried a sense of weight and meaning, shaped by the awareness that time was finite. For a man who had once hovered on the edge of death, the act of simply living into his 50s and beyond felt like a triumph. His health, as expected, remained a constant battle. Old injuries never fully healed, and the scars of countless surgeries left his body fragile. Pain followed him like a shadow, sometimes soft, sometimes overwhelming. Yet even in this, David refused defeat. He adjusted his routines, leaned on friends when needed, and poured what strength he had into the act of creation. "My body's been through hell," he admitted in one interview, "but my spirit? That's untouchable." His artwork in these years carried the quiet wisdom of a man who had seen both the worst and the best of life. Canvases often explored cycles, endings and beginnings, loss and renewal, death and rebirth. The fire, once painted as destruction, had become an almost sacred symbol in his work, not of tragedy, but of transformation. He told a gallery curator, "The fire took everything from me, but it also gave me a voice, and I've spent my life learning how to use it." Audiences felt this shift deeply. Viewers stood before his later works not just as admirers of art, but as participants in his philosophy. They saw not only color and form, but testimony. The story of a boy who endured unimaginable pain and grew into a man who chose creation over destruction. His shows were less about spectacle now and more about intimacy, offering people a space to reflect on their own struggles through the lens of his paintings. Marie's health declined steadily in these years, and David devoted himself to her care. Their bond, already extraordinary, became the anchor of his daily life. He was present for her in ways that few children ever are for their parents. cooking for her, driving her to appointments, sitting beside her through long nights. For David, this was not obligation but devotion. She had saved him countless times. Now it was his turn. When Marie eventually passed, David was devastated. The loss left a silence in his world that nothing could fill. She had been his constant, his protector, his partner in survival. Without her, the world felt colder, emptier. Yet even in grief, David honored her through his art. His paintings from that period carried a different tone. Tender, sorrowful, but full of gratitude. He said, "Every brushstroke now is for her. Every piece I make is her legacy too." Despite the loss, David carried forward. He leaned into friendships, into his art, into the community that had always supported him. And in doing so, he found a new kind of strength. The ability to live without the one person who had been there from the beginning, while carrying her love in every step. By the close of his 50s, David's story had crystallized into something larger than survival. He had become not just a man who lived through tragedy, but a man who transformed it into beauty, into art, into inspiration. He had endured the unendurable, and from it he had built a life of meaning. Crossing into his 60s, David carried the weight of decades, not just the ordinary wear of age, but the compounded toll of a life shaped by trauma, surgeries, and chronic pain. Every step was harder, every movement slower, but each day he lived still felt to him like a victory. For a man who once hovered on the edge of death as a child, the simple act of waking up each morning was never taken for granted. His art in these years reflected a softer, contemplative tone. Where once his paintings had been explosive with energy or symbolic of fire and rebirth, they now leaned toward themes of acceptance, continuity, and eternity. Shapes often blurred into one another, colors faded into gradients, as if he was painting the passing of time itself. Viewers noticed the change immediately. His canvases no longer screamed survival, they whispered peace. David began speaking more openly about mortality. Not with fear, but with a kind of curiosity. "I've lived through the worst fire," he said once. "So what's left to fear about dying? To me, it's just another step." This perspective gave him a rare calmness. He no longer chased legacy with urgency. Instead, he trusted that his life, his art, and his words had already planted seeds that would outlive him. Physically, life became increasingly difficult. Years of skin grafts and scar tissue meant that his body aged differently than others. Pain was constant, sometimes leaving him bedridden for stretches. But he had long since learned how to adapt, to shift his pace, to create within his limitations. When his hands grew stiff, he turned to smaller canvases or experimented with digital art, proving once again that creativity finds a way even when the body resists. The absence of Marie was a constant ache. Her death had left a void that could not be filled. Yet in his 60s, David often spoke of her presence not as lost, but as carried with him. He described her as a voice in his head, a warmth in his heart, a companion who remained even as time moved forward. His art reflected this too. Subtle tributes appeared in his paintings, gentle symbols of her presence woven into the layers. "She's still here," he would tell friends. "Just not in the way I'd like." Community became more important than ever. Friends, fellow artists, and supporters formed a circle around him, ensuring he was never entirely alone. Many of them saw in David not just a survivor, but a teacher. His life, his resilience, and his art had become a guidepost for others navigating their own pain. David welcomed this role, though he always resisted being placed on a pedestal. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I'm just a man who refused to quit." By his 60s, the world's memory of the crime that nearly killed him had begun to fade. Younger generations barely recognized his father's name, and even his own story was less frequently retold in the media. David was relieved by this. He never wanted to be a permanent headline. What mattered to him was that his work, his paintings, his words, spoke louder than the crime. And they did. His art continued to find homes in galleries, collections, and private spaces, reaching people who had never even heard of the fire that created him. For David, This was perhaps his greatest triumph, to no longer be defined solely by the tragedy that scarred him, but by the life he built after it. As David moved further into his 60s, the inevitability of age pressed closer. His body, already tested beyond measure, grew frailer with each year. Breathing sometimes labored, movements slowed, and hospital visits became more frequent. Yet he never let illness strip him of dignity. When friends asked how he was doing, his answer was simple: "I'm still here. That's enough." The art he created in these years carried a distinct serenity. His canvases often featured open skies, flowing water, and light breaking through shadow. Gone were the chaotic flames of his earlier years. In their place were calm horizons, quiet reflections, and an almost spiritual glow. Viewers described his later work as prayers in paint. David didn't argue. "Maybe that's what they are," he said once. "Prayers for peace, for myself and for anyone who's ever carried pain." He spoke less in public, but when he did, his words carried a profound gravity. No longer focused on survival or even resilience, he spoke of acceptance, of living with scars rather than fighting them, of finding beauty in imperfection, of honoring the lives we are given rather than the ones we might have wished for. His honesty made his voice more powerful than ever. Audiences listened not because he was famous, but because his truth resonated deeply. Loneliness remained, especially without Marie, but David had learned to fill the silence with creation. Friends often visited, and younger artists sought him out for guidance. He mentored them generously, reminding them that art was not about perfection but about truth. "Paint your scars," he told them. "Even if nobody sees them, paint them, because that's where your voice lives." As his body weakened, he began preparing for the inevitable. He organized his paintings, documented his thoughts, and made sure his work would continue to speak after he was gone. He wanted his legacy to be clear, not one of tragedy, but of transformation. "I don't want people to remember the boy who was burned," he said. "I want them to remember the man who lived." When the time finally came, the end of a long, extraordinary life, David faced it with the same courage he had shown since childhood. There was no fear, only a sense of completion. Friends recalled that in his final days he spoke of Marie, of art, of light. He said, "I was supposed to die as a child, but I didn't. I got all of this, and that's enough." David Rothenberg passed away in 2018 at the age of 42. Though his life was cut shorter than many, it was far longer than anyone once expected. And in those years, he created a legacy that outlived him. A legacy of art, resilience, and the unbreakable choice to live. In the days following his passing, tributes poured in. Galleries celebrated his work, survivors honored his voice, and countless people reflected on the power of his journey. His life was a reminder that even from unimaginable violence, beauty could emerge, that scars could become symbols, that survival could become art. When news of David Rothenberg's death spread in 2018, it carried a deep resonance. For those who had followed his journey since childhood, it was a moment heavy with reflection. Here was a man who, as a child, was never expected to survive even a week in the hospital. And yet, he had lived over 4 decades, carving out a life of creativity, resilience, and meaning. His passing was not just the end of a life. It was the closing of a story that had inspired countless others. Tributes came swiftly. Artists, survivors, journalists, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by David's words or paintings shared their memories. Social media lit up with images of his art, quotes from his speeches, and reflections on the courage he embodied. Many wrote that David had given them hope in their own darkest hours. Some said they had survived abuse, illness, or loss because his story taught them that life after pain was possible. The art world responded with reverence. Galleries that had exhibited his work organized memorial shows, curating collections that spanned his decades of creation. His paintings, once seen through the lens of tragedy, were now recognized as part of a profound artistic legacy. Critics wrote essays reevaluating his body of work, noting the shift from fiery resilience to serene acceptance in his later years. His canvases were described not just as art, but as philosophy, painted testimony of the human ability to endure. For survivors of violence and trauma, David's death was personal. He had been more than a public figure. He had been a voice for them. His honesty about pain, loneliness, and the difficulty of healing had created a sense of solidarity. He never pretended survival was easy, and that truth made his message all the more powerful. In his absence, many survivors carried forward his words as guiding principles. Paint your scars. Carry your pain, but don't let it carry you. Live anyway. Marie's absence was felt too. Many reflected on her role in shaping David's life, remembering that his survival had begun with her relentless advocacy in those early days after the fire. Mother and son had walked through the fire together, and though both were now gone, their bond lived on in every painting, every story, every life they touched. David's father, Charles Rothenberg, was scarcely mentioned in the coverage of his son's death. The man whose violence had set David's life on its course had become irrelevant to the story. This was David's final triumph, to ensure that in death as in life, his narrative belonged not to the man who harmed him but to the art and resilience he created from the aftermath. In the months following his death, foundations and advocacy groups invoked David's name in campaigns about child abuse, burn recovery, and resilience. Artists spoke of him as a trailblazer who showed how creativity could become a form of survival. His story became less about one crime and more about a universal truth, that scars, whether physical or emotional, could hold beauty, strength, and light. David Rothenberg was gone, but his voice was not silenced. It echoed in galleries, in survivor groups, in conversations among people who had never met him but felt they knew him through his work. His death marked the end of a body, but not of a legacy. In the years following David Rothenberg's passing, his story continued to ripple outward. Though he was no longer alive to speak, his art, his words, and the sheer example of his life carried forward with a momentum of their own. Memorial exhibitions became a focal point for honoring him. Galleries across California and beyond curated shows that spanned the breadth of his career, from the fiery intensity of his earliest canvases to the serene, meditative works of his final years. Visitors moved through these exhibitions not as casual observers but as witnesses. Many described the experience as transformative, as though walking through David's life in color and texture. For some, the art inspired tears. For others, it sparked an urgent sense of resilience in their own struggles. Writers and critics revisited his work with new eyes. In obituaries and essays, they noted that David had been more than an artist. He had been a chronicler of human survival. His paintings were compared to journals, each one a page in the story of endurance and transformation. Several critics suggested that his late works, suffused with light and calm, stood as some of the most moving contributions to contemporary outsider art in the last half-century. Beyond galleries, his story found its way into classrooms and survivor networks. Teachers used his life as a lesson in resilience, asking students to reflect on how creativity can emerge from suffering. Survivor groups invoked his words in workshops and retreats, using his example to help others reclaim their own voices. Burn foundations highlighted his journey as proof that healing is not only medical but also emotional, spiritual, and creative. Younger generations, many of whom had never heard of his father or the crime that scarred him, encountered David not through news archives but through art. To them, he wasn't defined by tragedy but by creation. They saw only the artist who painted light out of fire, and that shift from victim to visionary was perhaps the clearest sign that David had truly reclaimed his story. Even online, his presence lingered. Tributes, interviews, and footage of his speeches continued to circulate, ensuring that his voice reached people he had never met. Comments often echoed the same theme. He made me feel less alone. In a world where isolation and pain often silence people, David's legacy was one of connection. His death did not diminish his influence. If anything, it magnified it. Freed from the weight of his father's shadow, his story crystallized into something universal. The truth that scars need not be the end of a life. They can be the beginning of a new one. In the years beyond 2018, David Rothenberg's story did not fade. If anything, It grew no longer tethered to the immediacy of his survival, but to the timelessness of his message. He had lived and died, but what remained was a legacy woven into art, memory, and the enduring human need for examples of courage. Cultural memory is a curious thing. Some figures are remembered for their tragedies, others for their triumphs. David was remembered for both, but more importantly, for the bridge he built between them. His life became a living metaphor, often invoked in articles, documentaries, and social media discussions about resilience. Writers described him as a man who turned fire into light, a phrase that would echo repeatedly in the years following his passing. Art historians began to place David within a larger tradition of artists who used their work to transcend personal suffering. Comparisons were drawn to Frida Kahlo, whose chronic pain shaped her canvases, and to Jean-Michel Basquiat, who used art as raw testimony of inner turmoil. David was not simply a burn survivor who painted. He was a voice within this lineage, a reminder that some of the deepest art emerges from scars both visible and invisible. His paintings became more sought after as their scarcity grew. Collectors who had once overlooked his work for its painful backstory now recognized its universal power. Prices rose, exhibitions multiplied, and his canvases found homes not only in private collections, but in permanent museum spaces. Some curators argued that his art should not be confined to the outsider category at all, but celebrated as a central contribution to contemporary art's exploration of identity, pain, and resilience. Meanwhile, survivor communities continued to claim him as one of their own. His story became a beacon in burn recovery programs, a touchstone in child advocacy circles, and a source of comfort for abuse survivors worldwide. What made his message enduring was not perfection but honesty. He had never pretended healing was easy. He had admitted to loneliness, anger, and struggle. That vulnerability became part of his strength. Educational programs also found his story invaluable. Teachers used it to prompt conversations about empathy, resilience, and the human spirit. Students, many of them too young to remember the original crime, encountered David not as a victim but as a teacher through his quotes and art. For a new generation, he became an introduction to the idea that life's hardest blows can be reshaped into purpose. Perhaps most profoundly, David's story began to detach from the crime that created it. Charles Rothenberg's name appeared less and less in articles about David. Instead, his art, his philosophy, and his courage were the focal points. In this sense, David achieved what he had long wanted: to own his story completely, free of his father's shadow. By the late 2020s, retrospectives of his life often framed him as a figure of resilience in the same breath as figures like Malala Yousafzai or Nelson Mandela, people who faced violence but chose life. Though his scale was different, the essence was the same. He had turned pain into testimony, and testimony into light. In the years since his passing, David's story has been continually reintroduced to the world through modern media. Documentaries, podcasts, and digital tributes have ensured that his voice reaches audiences far beyond those who knew him while he was alive. Clips of his interviews circulate widely online. His calm reflections on pain, resilience, and art shared across platforms, often paired with images of his paintings. To many encountering him for the first time, David feels less like a historical figure and more like a living guide. Memorial projects further carried his message. Burn Foundations hosted annual art workshops in his name, encouraging survivors to use creativity as a tool for healing. Advocacy groups launched initiatives inspired by his philosophy of painting your scars, framing it not just as literal art but as a metaphor for resilience. The idea that every scar, physical or emotional, could become part of one's unique beauty and strength. His name became synonymous with empowerment, not pity. Artists across mediums cited him as an influence. Painters, poets, musicians, and filmmakers spoke of how his journey emboldened them to tell their own truths. Some referenced him explicitly, creating pieces dedicated to his legacy. Others absorbed his lesson more subtly, allowing his philosophy to ripple into their own creations. In this way, David's influence extended far beyond his own canvases, shaping the voices of a new generation of creators. His philosophy resonated deeply because it was not abstract, it was lived. When David said, "Paint your scars," he was not speaking metaphorically alone. He had painted his, literally and figuratively, for decades. He had shown the world what it meant to live with wounds visible to everyone and yet to transform them into art. That authenticity gave his words a weight that theory never could. Cultural commentators began to argue that David represented a shift in how society viewed survival. His story was not framed as mere endurance but as transformation, the idea that suffering, while brutal, could be reforged into something meaningful. In an era increasingly focused on mental health and resilience, his life became a timeless touchstone. For many, David's enduring lesson was this: survival is not about erasing scars, but about carrying them with dignity. His life embodied the truth that pain and beauty can coexist, that trauma need not define us but can instead refine us. It was this message that ensured his story did not fade into the archives of a single crime, but lived on as part of the broader human story of resilience. By the time a decade had passed since David's death, his story had moved well beyond the borders of the United States. The internet and global media carried his words and images across oceans, and his art began to appear in exhibitions abroad. What had once been the deeply personal journey of one man in California became part of a universal dialogue about pain, resilience, and the human condition. International galleries began to host retrospectives of his work. In Europe, exhibitions highlighted the philosophical depth of his later paintings, often connecting them with traditions of existentialist art. In Japan, audiences resonated with the themes of impermanence and beauty within scars, drawing parallels between David's story and the Japanese concept of kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making the cracks the most beautiful part. In South America, his life was contextualized alongside liberation art, framed as testimony to overcoming oppression and reclaiming narrative. These global exhibitions confirmed something profound. David's story was not confined to American crime history. It spoke to something universal, the experience of human suffering and the choice to transform it. Wherever his paintings were displayed, they ignited discussions not just about art, but about survival, justice, and hope. Human rights organizations also took note. Campaigns against child abuse, domestic violence, and torture invoked David's life as proof that survival is possible even after the most unimaginable pain. His words were quoted in awareness campaigns, often alongside images of his artwork. "Paint your scars" became more than a phrase. It became a rallying cry for resilience across cultures. Academics studied his legacy as well. Sociologists examined how David redefined survival by rejecting victimhood and insisting on identity through creativity. Psychologists cited his life in discussions of post-traumatic growth, using his journey as a case study in how trauma can lead not only to suffering but also to transformation. Art historians placed him in lectures alongside artists whose work embodied resilience and testimony, ensuring that future generations of students would learn his story not just as biography, but as philosophy. The impact rippled even further in survivor communities worldwide. In refugee camps, counselors told his story as a source of encouragement. In burn wards in hospitals far from America, patients were shown his interviews to help them imagine life beyond scars. In prisons, where men and women wrestled with guilt and survival, his philosophy of creating from pain resonated in unexpected ways. It became clear that David's life was no longer only his own. It belonged to a broader human struggle, the effort to make meaning out of suffering, to transform scars into stories, and to carry light through fire. As David's story spread globally, it began to take root not just in art and advocacy, but in the deeper fabric of culture itself. His philosophy that scars can be carried with dignity and even transformed into beauty became a framework for countless disciplines, from therapy to education to activism. In therapy, counselors used his life as an anchor for conversations about trauma. His interviews were played in group sessions, where survivors of violence or illness found comfort in his unvarnished honesty. He didn't minimize the pain, but he demonstrated that living with it was possible, and that creating from it could even be liberating. The phrase "paint your scars" became shorthand in some therapeutic circles for the act of reclaiming one's narrative. In education, David's story entered classrooms across continents. Teachers used his life as a teaching tool, not just for art students, but for those studying psychology, sociology, and ethics. His resilience prompted discussions about morality, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. High school students who knew little of the 1980s crime found themselves captivated by his philosophy, relating it to their own struggles with identity, belonging, or hardship. Activists also drew inspiration from his journey. Campaigns against domestic abuse, child cruelty, and systemic violence invoked David as a symbol of survival. His life became proof that even in the aftermath of devastation, it is possible to rebuild. In speeches across the world, advocates quoted him as a reminder that resilience is not passive endurance but active creation. Even popular culture absorbed his philosophy. Writers referenced him in essays, musicians in lyrics, filmmakers in documentaries. In one memorable exhibition in Berlin, his paintings were projected onto vast walls, accompanied by music composed in his honor. The effect was immersive. Attendees described feeling as though they were walking through his journey, engulfed in both the fire and the light that defined his life. Over time, David's name became a touchstone for resilience in conversations that had little to do with the original crime. His father's act faded into the background of history, while David's response, to live, to create, to inspire, remained front and center. This inversion of narrative was his ultimate victory. The man who had tried to destroy him became irrelevant. The boy who survived became eternal. Every life leaves traces, but few lives leave philosophies. David Rothenberg's was one of them. His story was more than a sequence of events, more than fire, survival, art, and death. It was, at its core, a philosophy of living. That scars, rather than being hidden, could be embraced, honored, and even celebrated as part of what makes us human. The symbol of the scar became central to his legacy. For David, a scar was not merely evidence of pain. It was proof of healing. His body bore hundreds of them, visible to all, unavoidable in every encounter. Many people might have seen them as disfigurements. David, however, transformed them into testimony. They were marks of battles survived, of nights endured, of mornings reclaimed. He once remarked, "I used to think my scars were my prison. Now I know they are my freedom. They mean I survived." In a culture obsessed with perfection, youth, and flawlessness, this philosophy was radical. It rejected the idea that healing means returning to what was before. Instead, it proposed that healing means integrating what has happened, carrying it with dignity, and refusing to let it diminish worth. This resonated deeply in an age where so many struggle with invisible wounds, mental illness, trauma, grief. David's visible scars made him a mirror for all the invisible ones people carry. Fire, too, became a symbol in his philosophy. The flames that nearly ended his life became, paradoxically, the metaphor for transformation. Fire destroys, yes, but it also clears, purifies, and reshapes. David's art often used fiery tones not as representations of violence, but as energy, vitality, rebirth. He taught that even destruction could be reforged into light. His philosophy can be distilled into three intertwined truths. Survival is not erasure. You don't have to get over pain to move forward. You carry it with you. Creation is resistance. Every act of art, love, or kindness in the wake of trauma is a refusal to let violence win. Scars are symbols. They are not the end of beauty but a new kind of beauty. One that speaks of truth, resilience, and the human spirit. Over time, these ideas were quoted, taught, and shared far beyond art galleries. Survivors of abuse repeated them to themselves as mantras. Therapists reframed them for their clients. Activists carried them into campaigns about dignity and resilience. David's words became a kind of secular scripture for those navigating the aftermath of pain. His philosophy also invited reflection on forgiveness and justice. David himself never claimed to forgive his father, but he did not let hatred define him. Instead of being consumed by vengeance, he redirected energy into art. This choice carried an implicit lesson. Forgiveness is not always necessary, but freedom from hate is. One need not reconcile with the perpetrator to reclaim one's life. In the broader cultural conversation, David's philosophy was often framed as a response to the universal question, how do we live after suffering? His answer was both simple and profound: by carrying scars with dignity, and by refusing to let trauma dictate the boundaries of our existence. As David's philosophy spread, it began to take on a life of its own. People who had never heard his voice in person adopted his language, reshaped it, and made it part of their own survival stories. Painting scars became more than a phrase. It became a cultural metaphor, invoked by writers, artists, teachers, and survivors to describe the act of reclaiming brokenness and turning it into strength. In art circles, his approach inspired new movements. Exhibitions around the world explored the theme of scars, not only in painting but in sculpture, photography, and performance. Artists openly referenced David, treating his life as a catalyst for creative exploration. In one series in New York, scarred metal was welded into luminous shapes, explicitly dedicated to his philosophy. In another, poets wrote verses carved into broken stone, each piece echoing his insistence that damage can coexist with beauty. In mental health communities, his story became a touchstone for post-traumatic growth. Counselors used his example to demonstrate that healing does not mean returning to normal, but building a new self from what remains. Survivors of war, abuse, and illness often reported that David's words gave them permission to stop chasing the impossible, the erasure of scars, and instead focus on building life around them. Religious and spiritual leaders, too, found resonance in his philosophy. Some Christian ministers compared his journey to resurrection after fire. Buddhist teachers invoked his life as an example of impermanence and transformation. Secular humanists embraced him as proof that meaning can be constructed in the aftermath of suffering without needing divine explanation. In every tradition, his life posed the same lesson: pain need not end the story. Academics reframed him as a philosopher in his own right. His statements were quoted in lectures about resilience, ethics, and aesthetics. Scholars argued that his life represented a practical philosophy of survival, one that challenged both the Stoic ideal of suppressing suffering and the Romantic notion of transcending it. Instead, David's legacy insisted on inhabiting suffering honestly, transforming it without erasing it. Perhaps most importantly, individuals around the world carried his philosophy into their private lives. A teenager struggling with self-harm whispered his words as she began to see her scars not as shame but as proof of endurance. A veteran with PTSD found strength in the idea that wounds could be honored rather than hidden. A grieving parent painted for the first time, inspired by David's insistence that art could hold pain without judgment. In all these ways, David's philosophy outlived him. It became less about one man's story and more about a collective human truth. His scars, once the mark of a single act of violence, grew into a universal symbol, proof that we can carry the fire of suffering and still make light from it. Looking back across the arc of David Rothenberg's life, it is almost impossible to comprehend the distance he traveled. From a motel room in 1983, engulfed in flames set by his own father, to art galleries and lecture halls where his voice and paintings carried hope, his story defied every expectation. By all measures, David should not have survived that night. And yet, he did, not only surviving, but living with a depth and honesty that left the world changed. David's life unfolded in stages, each one revealing something larger than survival itself. As a child, his existence was a battle against the odds. A body so badly burned it should not have endured, yet sustained by the fierce love of his mother and the strength of his own will. As a teenager, he carried the weight of disfigurement and the loneliness of being set apart, but he refused to disappear. He chose instead to step into the light, speaking his truth publicly even when it exposed his deepest vulnerabilities. As an adult, he transformed scars into art. His canvases became testimonies, every brushstroke an act of defiance against despair. His early works roared with fire, chaotic, fierce, insistent on survival. His later works glowed with serenity, light breaking through darkness, as if he had finally made peace with the flames. In both, he revealed that art is not an escape from pain but a vessel for it. And as a philosopher, whether he meant to be or not, David gave the world a vocabulary for resilience. He showed us that scars are not shameful, that they do not mark the end of beauty, but the beginning of a new kind. He taught us that healing does not mean forgetting or erasing, but carrying wounds with dignity and weaving them into the fabric of who we are. When he died in 2018, the world did not forget him. His passing was not an end but a widening of his influence. His art found its place in galleries and museums. His words echoed in survivor groups and classrooms, and his philosophy seeped into the lives of people who had never met him. In every corner of the world, his story reminded people of a simple but radical truth: that suffering does not define us, what we do with it does. In the end, David Rothenberg's story was never only about crime or even survival. It was about transformation. He began as a boy nearly consumed by fire, but he became a man who carried fire within him, not as destruction, but as light. His scars told the story of unimaginable violence, but they also told the story of endurance. They became symbols not of what was taken from him, but of what could never be taken. His will to live, to create, to give meaning to his pain. In this, he reversed the narrative of his life. The act that was meant to destroy him became the act that revealed his strength. The flames that should have silenced him gave him a voice that continues to echo long after his death. There is something profoundly human in his legacy. Each of us carries scars, some visible, others hidden. Each of us knows pain, loss, or betrayal. But David's life reminds us that these wounds, however devastating, are not the end of the story. They can be integrated, honored, even transformed into sources of connection and creation. David once said, "My scars are my story. They remind me that I survived." And in that single sentence, he gave the world a philosophy to live by. Survival is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to carry it forward with dignity, to turn wounds into wisdom, and to choose life again and again. Today, his paintings hang in galleries. His words ripple through classrooms. His philosophy shapes the healing journeys of people across the world. His father's name has long since receded into irrelevance, while David's shines brighter with each passing year. That is his final victory. He was not defined by violence. He was defined by resilience, creativity, and the unshakable will to live on his own terms. And so, as we close this long, winding journey through his life, we are left not with the image of a motel room in flames, but with the glow of a canvas, light breaking through darkness, colors layered over scars, beauty born from fire. David Rothenberg's life was proof that even the deepest wounds can become art. His legacy is proof that resilience can outlast violence. And his story is proof that no matter how dark the night, the human spirit has the power to create light. This is how David lives on, not in tragedy, but in triumph. Not in pain, but in meaning. Not in silence, but in the voices of all who continue to whisper his lesson. Paint your scars, carry them with dignity, and live anyway,